Hey there. So this is episode 2 of my channel. We are going through this kind of exploratory thing with through grok. So grok, and when I was growing up, it's this like, oh, how do I uh try to get smarter? How do I get more wise and whatnot? And obviously, you can look that up. And then grok kind of, with the recent AI developments, made it possible to like, okay, we're going to analyze all of YouTube and figure out what is would be considered from Grok's perspective intellectual. So I have you know done the making of the list, and we are going to get into kind of the higher subscriber count versus the lower subscriber counts, so-called intellectual conversations. So uh, last time I had this list, and we've got whatever 262 of the higher population subscriber count, and about what is this 178. So give or take, if I get through like, I don't know, 4 a week, um this would be like a year or some change to get through this list. So just to get started, for whatever reason, and I've seen this channel before, but Grok considers Tierzoo, Tierzoo, Tierzoo as an intellectual channel, which, um, spoiler alert, it's more of a comedy. Don't take it too seriously. It's making a lot of hypothetical, conversations about like gamification of reality, and then like redoing the perspective on reality from a video game kind of RPG view. So this is another difficult channel to try to assess the uh intellectualism, so to say, perceived from grok. Guess we'll go with our house cat's overpowered. um this should be more fun.
Three, two, one, go!
All right, we might have to speed this up, but
This game's tier list can seem pretty set in stone sometimes, but in reality, major shifts in the meta can happen extremely quickly, especially when new resource hotspots and points of interest open up. Builds which are well adapted to capitalize on these flashpoints can see dramatic ascensions on the tier list. One such event occurred when humans unlocked the food storage ability. This greatly improved the humans' survivability by giving them a consistent source of XP, even during harsh winters or famines. That is,
like, even though this is like, slightly comedic, but it's actually like making good points from an anthropology perspective, that you know uh, it's seeing these kind of technological discoveries, which obviously if you play video games and RPG and all that stuff, have these kind of like unlocked storage system. So I think it's doing a great job like making it digestible for, let's say, even like middle school students to understand and not get like completely bored with the study of anthropology. So let's continue.
if they could defend their stockpiles. These stashes were incredibly valuable, and could easily support entire colonies of rats and sparrows if improperly guarded. And while these Neolithic humans did have some techniques they could use to try and protect their precious grain on their own, ultimately their saving grace came in the form of a previously low-tier predator build that was barely scraping by in the North African savanna, the wildcat.
Just as a side note, there's an interesting, if anyone's played the Skyrim, and there's this one short video of like, obviously like Gen Alpha slang, vernaculars and lexicon being applied to Skyrim. And it's very funny where here, we can just watch it for a short clip. What's the, what is it called? Skyrim. It's not Gen Alpha, but what is it called? Talk? Brain rot. So this is like the hyperbolization of kind of, these clashes of, obviously it's like medieval, pre-medieval, European adventure, role play, fantasy, and then bringing it up to current standards. And of course there's a generational gap of like, so like somebody who's, 30, 40, 50 years old has no idea what these, like 12-year-olds are talking about, essentially. So I'll speed this up.
Hey, you're finally woke. You were trying to hop the border, right? Gridded right into that Imperial Mog, same as us. And that beta over there.
Phantom, you stormcucks. Skibidi was fine until you rizzed along. Simpire was chill AF. If you weren't malding, I could have copped that whip and been halfway to Gunnerfell.
I have no idea what they're saying. Like, but so, it's this interesting like dichotomy of, using video game language lexicons to try to explain these kind of, natural selection and kind of genetic adaptations.
A build which, once domesticated, would go on to become one of the most oppressive, overpowered predators in the current meta. But what is it about the house cat that makes it such a dominant threat? And how was it that the wildcat became better suited at taking advantage of pest infestations than other builds? To really explain the success of the house cat, we need to go way back and start our story just after the Miocene balance patch. This update granted mammals access to a new ability called Carnassial Teeth, a side grade of the Dentition skill tree, which allows users to gain bonus XP from carcasses and carrion sources. This may seem like a minor thing, but it completely changed up the metagame and made hyper-carnivorous builds a lot more viable, giving rise to a new archetype called the Carnivoran, a group which includes many of the most popular predator builds in the current meta. Carnivorans are divided into two factions, Caniforms and Feliforms. Caniforms are more general.
Yeah, so it's going over this like very detailed biology lessons that have got a lot of details, and you probably should have at least like a high school level understanding of, but it's making it digestible for, middle school boys to understand.
Generalist in nature and invest a lot into the olfaction skill tree, letting them track the sense of whatever they need, be it scavengeable carrion, prey, fruit, honey, water, or teammates, from a great distance. They also tend to have a lot of stamina, allowing them to run for long distances without tiring. Feliforms, on the other hand, doubled down on the Carnivoran archetype's original strategy. They spec'd into even more abilities meant to crank up the efficiency of the hyper-carnivore game plan. The ability Tongue Papillate allows felids to extract even more value from fresh kills. Instead of investing heavily into scent-based sensory power, Feliforms tend to focus more on their hearing and eyesight abilities. This doesn't help them scavenge, since things like carcasses and berries don't make sound, but it does make them incredibly good at detecting hidden prey. Also, in keeping with the Carnivoran's first major advancement, Feliforms also focus a lot more heavily on specialized dentition, optimizing their bite attacks to deal massive puncture damage, and more effectively hold onto prey so the user can deal bonus damage with their claws. Throw in a few more ambush-focused abilities like retractable claws and camouflage fur patterns, and you've arrived at the modern Felid, easily one of the most successful stealth assassin builds the game has ever seen. In fact, during the Ice Age expansion, Felids were such a dominant threat that many other predator builds had trouble competing with them at all. In the current meta, cats remain incredibly dominant in virtually every major terrestrial server.
What's the... They keep on saying meta, but this is like meta typically means... like... not retroactive. So meta is like a meta-analysis. So it's like a self, like a concurrent circle. So it's like a circle inside of a circle. So it's like going within itself. But the prefix meta originates from Greek, meaning after, beyond, between, or change. It is used to indicate a higher level, comprehensive, or self-referential perspective. Right, self-referential. Transformative process, blah, 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 position behind it after something. Okay, so like there's some video game use of this, like the term, the prefix meta, and it's, I think, being used as more of a strategy term.
Basically every cat, including the ones I like to throw shade at, is a threat. Not just to those of similar weight class, but even to builds that vastly outweigh them. Although their power stat tends to be fairly modest among carnivorans, through efficient use of critical hits, a skilled Felid player can take down just about anything. While the majority of the Felid player base was off rampaging through the upper weight classes, an offshoot of the faction opted to forego larger size and instead chose to spec into a few new abilities, meant to capitalize on exploiting the weaknesses commonly found in the lower weight classes. So let's finally start unpacking what makes the house cat so overpowered. We'll begin with a quick look at the cat's stats. We've got a build with upper mid-level intelligence, low defensive stats, decent damage, above average stealth, high mobility, and excellent perception. Right off the bat, something that might jump out at you is, well, the fact that nothing jumps out at you. Cats are supposedly some of the most broken predators of all time, and yet none of their stats seems all that busted on their own. Top tier builds tend to have at least one stat that is so high it completely invalidates the strategies of other players. But no, cats aren't able to use tools, they don't have a bone-crushing or venomous bite, they can't change colors, they can't tank attacks for days, they can't echolocate, and so on. So no obvious answer here. Next, let's check out their unique abilities. We talked about a few already, including the abilities that buff the XP rates from meat sources. These should not be understated, as without them you can pretty much entirely write off the viability of this build. Cats and all other mammals have the warm-blooded trait. This grants them greatly improved stamina regen rates, greater resistance to cold damage, and a bunch of other useful perks, but at the cost of much greater upkeep requirements, meaning they need to secure kills much more.
I'm just curious what the comment section's saying. I'm like, they don't share their kills. Cat flexing. I feel like the video was just an excuse for Tierzu to watch cat memes and call it work. Yeah.
Frequently than similarly sized cold blood builds. Without these abilities granting the cat bonus XP from meat, it would be very difficult for them to keep up with their energy needs, even with how efficient cats are at hunting. Cats can also move extremely quietly due to their soft toe pads and retractable claws, enabling them to easily get within striking range of prey through smart use of cover and line of sight. But okay, all types of cat, large and small, have those abilities. How about something more unique to house cats? For that, let's look at their primary perception-based ability, slitted pupils. This ability grants house cats extremely precise depth perception, greater than all other felids. This allows them to perfectly judge the optimal pouncing distance, massively increasing their odds of landing an immediate critical hit and
Sure, it just keeps going about cats. Let me see if it actually gets anything interesting.
This strategy is what has led to the complete collapse of several different player bases in the amphibian, reptile, bird, and mammal factions, as it truly is that oppressive. Now, while we were first looking at the cat's base stats, one thing you might have assumed right away was that the cat's lower defensive stats are its main weakness, and that cats function as a sort of glass cannon, with very little counterplay options when attacked. You might also assume that given the cat's high mobility, their primary defensive strategy is simply to run away when they feel threatened. And while their top speed is often enough to escape danger when needed, instead, cats employ their mobility stat defensively in a different way. This is where one of the most flexes are usually used to dodge attacks, but cats instead actually use their reflexes to deflect them. Surprisingly consistent and works on a lot more attacks than you might think, and potentially even open up opportunity of a mammal. But why does this playstyle make for such a good partnership with human players? Compared to dogs, they seem like they'd be much less useful party members. Humans broke the game and became the top tier build by using coordinated team strategies and tool use in order to utterly trivialize our matchup versus large mammals. Dogs easily slot right into this game plan, as they can help track and chase down large prey, and also sniff out any potential ambush predators that could disrupt and punish this strategy. When a successful kill is made, dogs and humans naturally split the reward and both benefit. Dogs are all chase down prey over long distance. Humanity unlocked the agriculture ability that the player base began to notice additional vulnerabilities they didn't need to care about before. Vulnerabilities that dogs couldn't really help with. When operating off of a hunter-gatherer strategy, large report, is to share in the shelf safer. Speaking, but in practice, all these things are
cats.
Singularity is key in order to crest the tree of life. In fact, planet is fit. If you do manage, I genuinely have never been in the description or scan the QR code on screen now. Thanks again for watching, and as always.
So, like, you know, this guy's funny. Yeah, I would recommend. I'm just gonna subscribe. It's, you know, if you subscribe, you're getting this kind of various biology lessons, like I said, in the context of, you know, video games. And then, yeah, it's, you know, the information is digestible. Is it something where, you know, some like average higher intelligence adult should subscribe to? Probably not. Is it interesting for explaining to kids? You know, talking about whatever, cats, dogs, reptiles, etc. I think this is, you know, very well constructed, well planned, a channel and videos. So going back to the thing with the intellectual channels list, Tierzu, okay, take that one out, go back to the main list. So here's just the kind of review system. I'm going to have it available in the descriptions if you wanted to take a look. Some of them have already been rated just for the sake of testing out the system. And then, you know, this is, yeah, it's, I would consider it journalism more than comedy. It's definitely not just, you know, it's a little funny, but the main purpose is, you know, essentially talking about, you know, basic sciences that have already been fully researched. So, funny video game, perspective, Jesus Christ, perspective on biology. So, yeah, this is 3/1/2026. All right. Then what was it? No, just take a copy of this, just so as an example. All right. So now we're gonna try one of the lower subscriber counts, 178. We're gonna do a random number generator, 178. 82. All right, what does 82 get us? 82. John McWhorter. Sweet. I know him. I already know him. Please subscribe to John McWhorter. This, I think he's got a channel. So he doesn't have a personal channel? That's crazy. Well, let me see. So the Glenn Show, I've seen the Glenn Show many times. He's like a consistent. It's not necessarily a guest. At this point, it's more of like a co-host. But that's crazy that John doesn't have his own channel because he's very, well known enough that I'm surprised he doesn't have one. So he's written a bunch of books. He's a professor, and well, let's just pick something out. I mean, even like he's getting interviewed by ABC News, 134,000 views. Yeah, let's see. Woke Money Machine. Was this Woke Money Machine? Yeah, sure. Why not? So this was yesterday, posted on the Glenn Show, and Glenn Laurie's the main, creator of the obviously Glenn Show, and then John John's like, like I said, a co-host pretty much. But yeah, I'm still surprised he doesn't have his own channel. All right, let's just start.
Social justice.
So this is 32 minutes. We'll try to like blaze through it, but yeah, let's see, 5,000 views in one day. Great.
Is not taxing billionaires. It's ensuring that a demographically appropriate percentage of blacks work at BlackRock, right? And that's how I think it serves the interest of the elites, right? What's being asked for is identity-based social justice, right? It is not to tax the people who lavishly endow the Mellon Foundation. The NEH dispenses about $78 million in grants toward the humanities in a given year. Mellon dispenses about $500 million. So it is just several orders of magnitude larger than anything else out there.
How is it that having a $500 million...
I think this is just like an intro snippet thing before, there it is. A minute of intro before getting into the
was a year of
the beginning of the show
of grant money going to scholar activists, furthering the interest of the ruling class.
Isn't part of it that a lot of these things are whether or not you fit in, and whether or not you're comfortable with the salad, and whether or not you can at least pretend to have read Anna Karenina, whether or not you, after the 1 or 2 glasses of wine, slip in an axe instead of an ask, which somebody with a PhD very well might.
Yeah, I lean toward that explanation. I don't believe in miracles so much, John.
Tyler, you have been on fire on the X. I have really enjoyed watching you lob all that stuff back. It's great.
John, you want to frame this discussion with Tyler by just saying a little bit about his piece on the Mellon Foundation and introduce the conversation that way?
Well, Tyler Austin Harper wrote a magnificent and magisterial piece for The Atlantic that basically says that the Mellon Foundation under the...
Yeah, I'm just going to do a quick, just kind of a background of talk, just saying, he's written a bunch of books. So John McWhorter, American linguist, the books that he's written: Woke Racism, How a New Religion Has Betrayed Black Americans, 9 Nasty Words, English in the Gutter. He studies linguistics. Woke Racism, same thing. 9 Nasty Words, Story of Human Language, Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History. Yeah, so like he's a popular enough writer. And then what was it? Columbia. Okay, Columbia University. All right. So
aegis of Elizabeth Alexander, who is Black, you could call her very much Black bourgeois, has declared that the Mellon Foundation will only, since 2020, be giving its money to causes that forward social justice. And I think Tyler...
Just another break. I know this is going to keep going, but for sure, subscribe to the Glenn Show. All right.
His basic claim is that that's great, but that it ends up shutting out an awful lot of things which these days can't get funded by other organizations because they have fallen by the wayside because of other forces. So if it's not about social justice, and if it's not something that you can fake being about social justice, you can't get funding as a humanities or social science person at all. And this is a problem. Tyler, is that fair?
Yeah, that's absolutely fair. I mean,
so he's got experience within academia because obviously he works at Columbia, and there's this long going narrative for this kind of this would be in the bubble of like the anti-woke, anti-DEI type narratives. And so he, John and Glenn both fit in within that realm of, would consider them like anti-DEI, and they make a greater emphasis about like, hey, you should meritocratically like evaluate people and their writings, and especially both of them professors, so they're doing a lot of writing papers. And then there's they're talking about the kind of greater echo chambers that happen in more so-called woke universities, that how like even genuine good work that has statistics backing it up, et cetera, either doesn't get published, they get fired for trying to publish it, and if they support it openly, they get in trouble. So
Mellon has, at this point, through no faults of their own, it is worth saying, but a de facto monopoly on humanities funding. There's been a retreat of both public and private grant making, public grant making through institutions like, obviously, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and then also private grant making through institutions like the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, that used to fund more humanities research, and in recent years have basically stopped. And that has left Mellon essentially the sole external funder in the humanities space. Just to give you a sense of the sort of magnitude of their monopoly, the NEH dispenses about $78 million in grants for the humanities in a given year. Mellon dispenses about $500 million. So it is just several orders of magnitude larger than anything else out there, which gives them the capacity to really influence and incentivize large swaths of the humanities to sort of follow one particular direction in scholarship. And for the last 7 or 8 years under Alexander's tenure, that has really been toward the sort of scholar activist model, the sense that, scholars, faculty members should not just be professors and researchers, but they should also be political advocates in some sort of way.
So what's wrong with that?
Well, you could say nothing's wrong with that. I mean, I would say, so there are two ways to think about this, right? One argument I'm making is that whether or not you think the scholar activist model is productive or not, it is one thing to say there are some people who do good work that is in the scholar activist mold, and it's another thing to say that is the only kind of work our primary grant maker in the humanities is going to fund, right? So Mellon.
So just a side note, this channel, this is, like I said, the Glenn Show, but like, John's a, essentially co-host, and they don't have, I don't think I've seen a very like adversarial conversation where, it's just like finger pointed and yelling. Typically they get people that, for the most part, not necessarily do they agree on the same things, but that like they have the same kind of perspective on civil discussion and how to say things, and then to not set up for like trying to hurt somebody else's feelings. And if there is disagreement, they're going to say, well, I disagree, and it's because of this, this, and this. And then, could you try to steel man your, your opponent's position? It's like very like extra civil, even if the topic itself, like being talked about, is very sensitive. So
has always, or at least for a long time, funded work that was more progressive, that might be legible as scholar activism.
Yeah, that's not new.
That is not new. What is new is the monomaniacal focus on really that kind of model of scholarship. It used to be the case that, yes, they would fund some stuff that fell under the auspices of scholar activism, and then they would fund the Folger Shakespeare Library, or they would fund, work coming out of classics departments, et cetera. So there weren't the same kind of guardrails on the sorts of scholarship they would fund. So part of my argument is that there's been a real hemming in of free inquiry in the humanities because, again, this multi-billion-dollar philanthropy has put a rather narrow Overton window on the kind of research that they're willing to fund. Now, there's a second piece to.
So, just another side note, I'm trying to kind of go to the what I was talking about with my kind of political, studies, is that what these guys are talking about is how these so-called liberal arts programs with philosophy, etc. They're so I made this little spectrum you see on the screen that they are making claims. These guys, on the Glenn show, are making claims that these top tier universities with a gajillion dollars in money, rather than making everybody, allowing everybody to talk and contribute some, publishings, they're very cherry picking who gets to say things, who's not saying things. And then within this spectrum that I was talking about before, this is, mine, that they're, again, focusing, the universities are leaning towards non-oppositional, or, what I'm claiming, totalitarian type of tendencies, leanings, power dynamics, instead of adversarial, which would be like how, kind of peer-reviewed journals, peer-reviewed documents would, you make something, you send it out into the world, and then you get hopefully a bunch of other people to, the scholars, to agree with it or disagree with it, and then let the public, or let, these kind of academia circles duke it out. But obviously these guys are talking about how that's not really happening, where, this adversarial kind of free flow of information is not being allowed to happen.
To this, Glenn, to your point, what's wrong with scholar activism? I mean, from my point of view, as I like to joke, a soft Marxist. I'm not an orthodox Marxist in the sense that I don't, militate for the dictatorship, the proletariat, or what have you. But I do think the ruling ideas tend to be the ideas of the ruling class. And I think it is curious, right, that this progressive nonprofit worth $500 million, that is really part of the left flank of the oligarchy, should be so interested in funding all these ostensibly radical ideas. Now, on the one hand, you might say, by some kind of miracle, a genuine revolutionary project has bubbled out of the elite. Or you might say that there's some way in which that these ostensibly radical projects are actually serving the interests of the ruling class.
I might say that.
Yeah, I lean toward that explanation. I don't believe in miracles so much, John. And so, I think part of the story here, and part of the story I'm trying to tell too, is situating this scholar activist turn within the financialization and corporatization of the university, particularly since 2008, which austerity cuts after the Great Recession hit the humanities really hard. Tuition kept going up, up, and up, and there was a lot of pressure for the humanities to justify themselves. Why should you major in theater or English or the classics or philosophy when you could major in accounting and have a much better chance at being able to actually pay back your student debt? And the argument the humanities kind of settled into, which Mellon has very much exacerbated and accelerated, is that no, we can't compete with the economics department on return on investment, but we can help you be a good person, right? We can help you make a measurable impact in the real world through the unique political insights and status quo disruption that you will learn in the humanities. And there's something deeply utilitarian about that, right? The idea that the point of scholarship is to make impacts out in the real world. It's not.
So like there's this, narrative within post-secondary. So, you could call it tertiary if you wanted to be more like specific, but there's this general narrative about how, like, why, for example, for the most part, everyone's gone through like, primary, secondary school. So like that elementary, middle school, and high school in the American context, is that, well, why don't, post-secondary and post-secondary education focuses on more specialization? So that, there's this, there's the emphasis now of like going back to blue collar trades for, let's say, high school, that rather than doubling down on gen eds or general education in this, what he's, kind of referencing, Tyler's referencing of like the, of like broad civics type, education, that there's more schools are saying, hey, let's, introduce a welding class. Let's introduce a carpentry class. Let's, do these things that, narrows this kind of purpose of high school towards, hey, why not get them some practical skills so that they can use it in the real world that could probably, make money. Like, again, specialization. And then, what the post-secondary education, the same thing. It's like there was or still is this emphasis that regardless of what, let's say you get a associate's degree or bachelor's degree, master's, PhD, whatever, you take a bunch of gen ed classes that have no direction towards specialization. So that if you're taking, let's say you're taking a humanities class, like a degree in humanities, in, some, whatever, let's just say like civics 101 or something, that, you're still having to take like a math class. You still have to take maybe a stats class, calculus, maybe a chemistry, etc. Even if you're going towards the social sciences degree, that, at least the stats would kind of make sense, but like, did you actually have to learn how to do calculus in order to be a social scientist? Not really, if you're just going to be writing a bunch of papers for the rest of your life. So, even if you're doing whatever, a degree in business, that you still have to take like a chemistry class, a biology class. And the idea is, it's just, it kind of, it's trying to give it, to really boil it down. It's kind of like the idea of everybody has to read the same books in order to have the kind of monoculture unity or unification, so that if everybody learns biology, then they're, more likely to, let's say, be interested in, for example, climate change topics and how, the deforestation and all that kind of stuff is a problem. So that there, it doesn't, it shouldn't have to be mandatory, but of course they're making it mandatory. And, there's a greater argument to be made saying that, okay, maybe in, elementary school, middle school, high school, that you should have these kind of gen ed things so that everyone, like I said, speaks the same language, read the same books. And so having, developing that kind of monoculture. But in post-secondary, tertiary education, why making that emphasis? Because, for the most part, anybody who's going into university on average is going for specialization. They're saying, I'm going to this school to get this degree. And then hopefully, that will be a stepping stones for a job, a career, an occupation, a trade, something. So, it's, I'm not saying one's better than the other. It's just that, if we're going to advertise it as specialization, just do specialization. But if we're just going to say, hey, this is going to be the new standard of, what's considered the minimum for the average citizen, which, it pretty much gotten to that point of like maybe 100 something years ago, university requirement as a general person that you pick off the street wasn't really an expectation. That, once you had a degree 100 years ago, that showed that you were trying to be special within society, not just as a general, like somehow, like figuratively more enlightened person within society. So let's get back to the video.
Learning for learning's sake. Knowledge doesn't have any intrinsic worth except insofar as it can, do something tangible. And that is not a very humanistic way of thinking about the value of knowledge. And so I agree, Glenn, I don't think all scholarship in the Scholar Activist model is inherently legitimate, but I do think it is symptomatic of the utilitarian turn the university has taken in the last 20 years and really for the past half century.
Yeah, but that's not the Mellon Foundation's problem, a person might say. There's plenty of opportunity to raise money for the humanities from other sources. Unfortunately, the humanities have been unable to, or without the capacity to persuade funders to underwrite their endeavors. And Mellon is free to pursue its agenda. It doesn't have to be the only agenda in town. But there's something I want to ask you prior to that, which is how is it that having $500 million a year of grant money going to scholar activists furthering the interest of the ruling class?
Yeah. I mean, one thing I think, one of my sort of longstanding pet theories and arguments about the trends in higher education we've seen over the last decade or two. I think there's a certain way of talking about what gets called wokeness that sees it as just the latest iteration of political correctness, right? It is just another version of PC.
Well, doesn't want to do that. Let's try that again.
People will say,
There
well,
it
these
is.
institutions have long been liberal. This is not really anything new. And the way I think about wokeness is a particular response to the economic conditions in the university and broader society post 2008, right? Where after Occupy Wall Street in 2011 and the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2015, both of those sort of really big political movements in the United States emphasized student debt and really framed universities as these exploitative debt machines that are saddling people with debt they're never going to be able to pay back, and college should be free, right? That's one of the sort of like big things that comes out of that.
That started after 08. Yeah.
Yes, that starts after 08, right? And so the universities are kind of under assault from this populist backlash. They have lost the moral high ground because you have these movements that are portraying them as basically debt lords, right? And so how do you reclaim that?
There should be an emphasis like universities are a business. And there's no like, you know, even if it became publicly funded, they have a business model. They've got incomes, revenues, they've got expenses. They need to have profit margins. Like, it's not ever intended to take a loss, financially speaking. So, you know, you could call it like, oh, it's just a social program. Kind of. Like, if this was just like a soup kitchen, you know, where you're just throwing money at it and it's for the sake of, you know, whoever's hungry gets to show up, get free food. That's one thing, but they're clearly not doing that. Yes, there's, you know, grants and tuitions and all that kind of stuff, but that's like a kind of eaten cost that they're ideally structured, you know, staffed, managed, all that kind of stuff to make a profit. And yes, the tuitions are the, you know, a big contributor, but what these guys are talking about, it's like there's still all these like huge funding models to with various organizations where, and I think they were, you know, referencing this before, of like how money's getting involved into academia and scholarly work, pumping out, publishing things based on who is giving them money, where you know, there's a real serious problem where if, you know, let's say the Coca-Cola company sends $1 billion gajillion to Carnegie Mellon and then saying, you know, hey, sugar's not that bad, you know, let's publish those studies where it just says fat's real bad, you know, but sugar's great, you know, that they're, you know, these are political moves, and universities are no different. They're not, you know, on this like higher elevated kind of scholarly ethereal realm of, you know, being untouched by rotten politics. So
moral high ground. Well, we're not going to lower tuition, and we're not going to change the basic financial model, and we're not going to stop operating as glorified hedge funds and you know, real estate empires. But what we can do is lean into social justice rhetoric, because that's basically free, in order to try to reclaim the moral high ground and to defang economic populism by an appeal toward elite social justice, right? Where, as I like to joke, social justice is not taxing billionaires, it's ensuring that a demographically appropriate percentage of blacks work at BlackRock, right? And that is really what we've sort of, you know, that's how I think it serves the interest of the elites, right? No one is asking, you know, what's being asked for is identity-based social justice, right? It is not to tax the people who lavishly endow the Mellon Foundation. I don't think it's a coincidence that there's not exactly a lot of Marxist or class-based scholarship or class-based forms of activism being funded by the Mellon Foundation. That's, you know, that's not a coincidence.
And Tyler, I think we would agree that it's not that Elizabeth Alexander is thinking these things. I mean, you seem to have an idea that she is perhaps working out a certain kind of survivor's guilt or a certain sense of association with Black people other than her, but that it all comes out as the same effect. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think Elizabeth Alexander is probably a true believer, if I had to guess. I don't know because she refused to multiple requests for an interview, so I don't really know what her perspective on this whole thing is, but I sort of operate under the assumption that she's in good faith, that she really believes in these things, but I don't think it's a coincidence that she comes from a family of famous Black elites that stretches back to the 19th century, that she comes out of Obama world, she's a personal friend of the Obamas, that she has, these very sort of elite connections. And that, yeah, I don't think, it's a coincidence that somebody of her background, with the kind of friends she has, would think of social justice as in primarily this identity-based capacity. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was on a radio show with her on NPR a very long time ago, and she, both in kind of the off mic session and during it, and I honestly don't remember what the show was, but she at the time was running an African American studies department. And I said that it worried me, and this relates to our general conversation here. I said it worried me that many African American studies departments, and probably most, operate upon a basic idea that racism is the thing that's going to be studied the most. Maybe some Swahili lessons, but mostly it's about racism rather than Blackness, which is a much larger category. And Elizabeth was not hostile or anything like that, but I could tell that she genuinely couldn't understand what I meant, which suggested that to her, studying racism in that way is the only way it could be. And I'm not going to call her a true believer or anything, but that's where her mind seemed to be. Yeah.
I'll admit to being a little disturbed by the personal dimension of the criticism of Alexander. She's elite. She comes from a certain kind of family.
Yeah.
She's friends with the Obamas. Since when did that get to be a curse? I envision an angry, alienated academic or former academic. You were at Bates, now you're at the Atlantic. Grinding an axe over there somehow and looking for an excuse to take a shot at her. Where am I wrong?
Well, I mean, what I would say, I don't have any problem with Elizabeth Alexander on a personal level, but one of the reasons why I think her background is relevant is that it's part of a pattern we see in these elite universities or these elite para-academic institutions that are ostensibly on the side of social justice. And that is that they tend to elevate people of color who have relatively fringe beliefs as compared to the vast majority of people of color as representatives and spokespeople for their interests, right? We saw this with Claudine Gay at Harvard, who comes from a silver spoon family of concrete Haitian overlords, or Haitian concrete overlords, right? And we've seen it with people like Elizabeth Alexander. I think her background is relevant because she is chosen in no small part because of her background. It's not an accident. There's not a shortage. There are working class, middle class, Black intellectuals who come out of places like Harvard and Yale and who have fantastic pedigrees, but for some reason, they aren't being elevated to the top of institutions like Mellon or Harvard. In fact, at Harvard, a number of much more qualified Black scholars with slightly more modest backgrounds were passed over to make Claudine Gay, who was a kind of mediocrity, at least in terms of her academic work, to elevate her to the presidency. So I think it's relevant. Look, it is not her fault that she is born into the family she's born into. But at the same time, it is not an accident that it is people in that mold that ascend to the heights of these institutions. I also think it's just worth noting, again, people like her are hired to represent the Black community. And her views, Black Americans are really the most socially conservative flank of the Democratic coalition, right? Black Americans are on the whole have more socially conservative views than a number of other demographic groups. And the idea that we're going to appoint to these elite institutions these sort of Black representatives that have views that are wildly out of step with many working class Americans of color, I kind of find it grating. And so, yeah, look, I'm sure she's a lovely person. Again, I don't know because she refused to speak to me, but I think it's fair to point out the world in which she's coming out of.
Tyler, do you think that this is just a gentle pushback? Because I'm just trying to imagine white administrators out of some kind of deliberation choosing Claudine Gay and Elizabeth Alexander over the types that you're talking about, who Glenn and I call them the people with three names. And it's not that they're antagonistic, but the people you're talking about tend to have three names as opposed to Elizabeth Alexander and Claudine Gay. And why not them? And I'm thinking, isn't part of it that a lot of these things are whether or not you fit in, and whether or not you're comfortable with the salad, and whether or not you can at least pretend to have read Anna Karenina, whether or not you, after the one.
Right. So, John's talking about like how they've got these non-adversarial personalities, right? You don't want, these universities don't want true adversity. They want like pretend diversity where they'll choose like Claudine Gay and somebody who already personality-wise agrees, but Glenn Loury would not be, hired as the leader of Harvard anytime soon. I mean, it would have to take like a monumental cultural shift in order for that to happen. Yeah.
1 or 2 glasses of wine, slip in an axe instead of an ask, which somebody with a PhD very well might. Because Elizabeth Alexander and Claudine Gay are not that person I just described with 3 names. And I'm not saying the 3-name person is a slob, but still there are some subtle class issues there. Is it maybe just birds of a feather and they figure she's one of us as opposed to the 3-name person?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely it. I think it's birds of a feather. I don't think it's some conspiracy, to be clear. I don't think it is. There's some the board of trustees is a cabal that is conspiring to install a black elite to push a economically defanged form of cultural radicalism. I don't think anyone is thinking that. I think they probably thought, I like her poetry and she seems smart and I enjoy hanging out with her and she'll be great to lead this foundation. But I think it's important to distinguish rights from responsibilities. Does Mellon have the right to fund whatever they want to fund? For sure. But if you are in the position of being the sole funder, sole major external funder of the humanities, at some point I do think you have a responsibility in recognition that through no fault of your own, you have found yourself in this place of de facto stewardship to think about how I'm shepherding the health of the humanities at this moment where I do have this immense amount of control. And so, yes, you can absolutely argue they have the right in a free society. They absolutely do. But have they exercised their rights responsibly? I think is a fair question to ask, and really what I'm trying to get at here.
You know, I knew the former president of the Mellon Foundation, William Bowen, pretty well. This is going back 20 years.
The River William Bowen?
He was, William Bowen, former president of Princeton University, an economist who I think for like 15 years or so was president of the Mellon Foundation. He funded some of the research that we did at this small institute I ran at Boston University, and he was a big proponent of defending affirmative action. I was writing in that spirit. Mellon actually underwrote a conference in South Africa that I attended about affirmative action in the two countries, USA and the RSA. But I think he'd be rolling over in his grave to see what has happened at Mellon. He was an institutionalist. He believed in funding the library stuff and these institutional building things. He's also the Mellon Mays scholarships for minority students pursuing PhDs at elite institutions. And you mentioned the board. Isn't the board ultimately in charge of what the foundation is doing?
So just as a side note, there's this concept, I guess I haven't seen it coined officially, but what I'm calling the second generation problem of there's this consistent, within all of, human existence of the first generation that starts an organization, a program, performance, whatever you want to call it, are the most dedicated. They've got the principles to, get that idea going. And because they lived in a society that didn't appreciate it. So, any project, even if you're a father of a child, if you experience poverty and then you go work your ass off and then get something, right? A nice house, cars, etc. And then now the second generation comes into that without experiencing that kind of adversity, in their lives. They're just born into this, let's say, type of luxury. So like this guy's talking about, professors in academia that there's the second, at least second, third generation at this point, but of people that didn't have that kind of adversarial upbringing. They're just born into this academia and they don't have this appreciation for, this kind of, what these guys are talking about, this, affirmative action, at least as it was originally conceived of. So, it was one thing to say, hey, there are systemic barriers for, racial minorities to get their foot into the door because of, Jim Crow type kind of inclinations and feelings. So why not make it, the application and interview process race blind, right? It has no idea what the race of the individual was, trying to get a job, trying to get into academia, trying to get into any of the, kind of higher, class occupations or careers. And then obviously now it's like, no, it's tripling down on being race conscious and including that in as a factor when picking people. So, hopefully, these guys kind of explain more about that process in history.
The president serves at their pleasure. What has happened at Mellon in terms of the governance of the institution, do you know, that has resulted in this sorry circumstance that you're so adept at describing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I spent a lot of time on the reporting, really about a year. I was obviously working on other things as well, but it is pulling teeth because Mellon has so much power to get anyone willing to talk about the organization. Simply because, if you criticize Mellon, you risk. I talked to a lot of grant administrators, people in charge of helping professors and departments at their institutions solicit grants from outside funders. And those people would basically only talk on background or off the record because they're so worried about losing their Mellon funding, which at this point is basically all their funding. So getting a sense as to institutionally what was behind Alexander's particular rise wasn't the easiest egg to crack. But I do think it's worth noting in terms of the way the foundation has run, under Alexander, many of my sources said that it became, I'll use the word, more authoritarian, in the sense that Mellon used to, in a really good faith way, pre-2018, yes, they always had their institutional priorities, but they also recognized that universities and colleges have institutional priorities. So a representative from Mellon who specialized in that region and who was familiar with, the folks working in that region would meet with a grant administrator at, say, Smith College. It's just a random example. I didn't talk to anyone from Smith, but meets with a grant administrator from Smith. That grant administrator will say, well, at Smith, we just had some prominent retirements in the history department. We're really concerned right now about rebuilding our history department, which had historically been strong. That's really what we care about. And Mellon would say, well, right now Mellon is really interested in funding more projects that have some degree of interdisciplinarity. So we're happy to give you money for the history department, but do you think you could be willing to, say, create maybe an interdisciplinary minor between the history and the classics department? That way, this interdisciplinary thing we're trying to get going could have some legs. And they would say, sure, that sounds like a fair compromise, right? Now it is much more, we have the money. We care about XYZ, largely identity-based initiatives. And if you want our money, you play ball, and otherwise you can pound sand, basically. And Alexander has, I'm told, exercised a great deal more authority over grant making than previous, under previous iterations of Mellon, where yes, the president had some initiatives they particularly cared about, but there was a lot, delegates, sort of middlemen at Mellon would have a lot of authority to work hand in glove with institutions and try to find a compromise on everyone's priorities. And that, I'm told, is basically gone. It's now my way or the highway.
I'm sure she feels that she's doing the right thing. But,
no doubt.
What dismays me about all of this is that it's so anti-intellectual. And what I mean by that is just that we're dealing with such a narrow sliver of what it is to wonder about anything. And the Montessori kid in me just does not go for that. The idea that you're going to only do social justice, maybe people like, let's pull it away from her. Maybe the idea is that they think that that's 90% of anything anybody might be interested in, partly because that's what happens to interest them. But I don't think they quite understand that that's a...
So if you haven't been keeping up to date with this kind of cultural terms, John just said the word social justice. So that's what I was talking about before, which is like, it's one thing to make the application in, getting your foot into the door race blind, that it's not even a factor. Just look at them with their skill sets. Social justice is this idea of, the current very popular, cultural trend, you could, roughly call it, is that we should include race as a factor to combat the justice part, again, big quotes, justice of trying to fix wrongdoings from the past. And, unfortunately, there is no actual statute of limitations, right? They're just, if you're advocating for social justice, you're only going into the past however many years, and it's typically cherry picked. It's typically only focusing on one type of race for only, let's say, the last 200 something years. So that's the actual, even how the proponents of social justice, how they would define it, is that this is trying to get back the sense of, reducing, they could say they're reducing the amount of injustice or the feelings of injustice that people currently experience with making these types of actions.
Sliver of what it is to live the life of the mind. They're taking us back to the scholastics in the 12th century in terms of what we're allowed to actually think about. And how long does that go? And how many interesting ideas don't get funded because of this narrow, contingent mission, which ultimately, and I don't think these are bad people, but ultimately it's based on people who are kind of giving a signal to a kind of God rather than really thinking about what a foundation should be all about, if it's even nominally about the life of the mind.
Yep.
And it's hard to watch something like that when they have all of the money, because there's so many things that are interesting that really aren't about social justice, and that doesn't make them trivial. They're saying that it's trivial if it's not about social justice. That's
But the thing is, John, they don't have all the money. They have all the money that is now being devoted to philanthropy in the space of the humanities, but they don't have all the money. There's a lot of money in Silicon Valley, for example, that is being used for one thing or another, but not for this thing. And I just have to ask the question, why are the humanities unable to attract the attention of other deep-pocketed philanthropic endeavors to support their work?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really good question. I think partly it is American culture is very utilitarian and only more so by the day, right? In no small part because of the changes in science and technology brought about in the last 30 years. I think we've become ever more utilitarian. I think that's part of the problem. I think part of the problem, and not that we need to look to billionaires or very wealthy people to solve all of our problems, but I think what is going on with the humanities funding landscape is inextricable from cultural shifts within the oligarchy and the billionaire class, where Andrew Mellon, for example, funded museums and libraries and opera houses, and it used to be the case that the rich had a sense of noblesse oblige, that yes, they worked hard for their money, but also there is some degree of providence built into that they are fortunate, that this isn't just a pure meritocracy, and so they need to give back to their communities in some sort of way. And that has been really just shot in the head over the last 50 or so years, where we do not see very wealthy people giving money to the arts, to opera houses, to libraries in inner cities. That is basically all gone. So, Glenn, I guess I would say, look, I'm not going to get on a soapbox and say that I think
there's no way to research this thoroughly. That's more of like a grok question, but frequently you have, it's essentially like sponsorships of rich people, rich companies wants to buy or, send a bunch of money to, I don't know, a sports stadium and have it named after themselves, to donate a bunch of money so that they have this kind of sponsorship. So I don't know if the philanthropy aspect, and it's definitely within business. So those are individual corporate companies. Yeah, not sure about that one.
Humanities have done a good job advocating for themselves to the public. I don't think they have. But at the same time, I think something that is also very relevant to this discussion is that rich people used to fund the arts and they just don't anymore because their priorities have shifted. Whether you want to say, well, they're giving more of their money to charities that make a concrete difference in the real world and funding malaria nets in Africa or whatever, you can certainly argue that. But I do think just the sense of noblesse oblige has collapsed over the last 50
years. Are museums in the same tight spot? Yes. Are opera houses in the same tight spot?
I know less about opera, but I know theater certainly is. Yeah,
opera are, yes.
Yep. And actually, I've not for this piece, but I've spoken to somebody very high up in the world of theater who's a black man who has said there are similar problems in the world of theater where the Ford Foundation exercises a great deal of power to sort of dictate what kind of theater can be funded, and it is mostly not black art for black art's sake, but it's mostly in a more activist-y, social justice-y idea.
I mean, it'd be interesting, not necessarily could I steelman the oppositional argument, but, we're talking about, like I said before, these are universities and, so-called nonprofits, that non-governmental organizations that, still have a business model, that if they're doing some sort of social general ed type contribution to society, the equivalent of a soup kitchen, wasn't business wise, it's very difficult to structure it as profitable. So, rather than giving up on the kind of NGO nonprofit mission, the mission statements and all that, you get into the point where you start whoring off to anybody who's got money. And it's not terribly surprising that, if let's say Coca-Cola is here, I'm going to give you $1 gajillion to say that sugar is good for you, and you should have as much sugar as you want. And then you don't have a business model that can reject that type of offer, then, it becomes rotten. So, it's an interesting kind of like analysis about the dynamics of NGOs when, you know, it would make sense to just have it as a government entity instead of a non-governmental entity, that if it's going to be a purely like, hey, this is for the public good type thing, to not be under pressure, you know, to get bribed essentially. So
Yeah.
It's funny. I imagine appealing to Silicon Valley as an artist. The musical Hamilton would get money, but if it weren't something as, funky and interesting and, turning the tables as that, it would be really tough because you don't have Mark Zuckerberg thinking he's not going to go to heaven unless he gives some money to a museum or something like that. And
exactly.
also the religious impulse is gone too.
Yeah,
and
secularization, absolutely.
Yeah, I'm not sure who we would ask.
There is a question of why are the humanities not eliciting sufficient funding from the universities themselves, right? Mellon is an external funder, but obviously the universities themselves are also internal funders of the humanities. They fund research in their own institutions, et cetera. Part of the story of the crisis of the humanities is, yes, a collapse in external funding, but also a collapse in internal funding. Part of that is about how universities reproduce their donor class. I went to an undergraduate college, Haverford College, that still has a very strong liberal arts tradition, very strong tradition of the humanities. And in the landscape of elite small colleges, it is one of the poorer ones. And it's one of the poorer ones in no small part because it graduates so many people in the humanities and so many people who go into things like the Peace Corps or into the arts, right? And so a lot of universities, the moment students are getting in the door, a lot of colleges, often in social justice garb, are pushing students towards STEM in ways that are both explicit and implicit, right? Some colleges, for example, will have programs for first-generation college students where they come a week before their first semester of their freshman year, and they talk about majors. And one of the things they talk about is, well, if you major in pre-med, you might make this amount of money. But if you major in theater, you might make this amount of money. And it's just being transparent because you, coming from a working class background, we just want you to know, to make clear these economic pathways for you. And part of that, sure, I'm sure it's out of the goodness of their heart, but part of it is too, creating the conditions for the reproduction of the university's own donor class. There is a reason why 50% of people graduating from Princeton end up going straight to consulting, Wall Street, or big tech. One of the reasons is obviously students want to choose those pathways, but part of it too is the universities push them there because they want people going into high income careers where then they can give money back to the universities. But to answer your question, Glenn, do the humanities have some fault? Absolutely, right? I mean, there has been a social justice gobbledygook trend in the humanities that predates Mellon very certainly, right? And so I have no interest in denying that whatsoever. I think it is because the humanities over the last 20 or 30 years, as tuition has gotten more expensive, have contorted themselves to try to prove that they're a practical option alongside the economics department or alongside pre-law or pre-med or whatever else. And one of the ways they've done that is to focus on these, more political, more moralized strategies of justification. I think of the humanities, to use a phrase from Leo Strauss, as concerned with the permanent problems, right? These issues that have plagued human beings from time immemorial: how to live, how to die, how to keep peace, what is war. And I think students are still really interested in that, right? And there's a fair question as to whether humanities departments are doing enough to offer that to them. I think that's absolutely true, but I think it is hard to disentangle the fact that the humanities have not sold themselves well from the set of underlying economic and material conditions that have put them in a position where they constantly have to justify themselves in terms of return on investment.
Tyler, when you talked about this verbally, you're really making me realize I've been teaching for 30 years, and what a sea change there's been in terms of what the typical student was about in 1994 and what the typical student now is about in terms of what they go off and do, et cetera. Yes, something major has happened, and it's partly what they're being presented with, and it's partly the school and partly their parents. Yes.
You must see this in linguistics too, I imagine, which is...
we have students, but in terms of whether or not...
Just wanted to take a little side trip. There's this interesting... I mean, it's fucking hilarious, but... oh, crud. No. What am I doing? Okay, we're still good. So, useless degrees. Oh, by year. Oh, good. Let's say 2025. Apparently, we haven't got the update. All right, let's just pick... Oh, Caleb Hammer. Sure. This one is, like, insane. So, like, just... What do you... As an idea of like I said, universities, colleges are technically a business. They're trying to sell, like a degree, so to say, or at least, that kind of academia experience. And if you just, it's this trend, and you're going to see this video, real soon. There's this trend of like coming up with more customized, kind of unique degrees to try to sell to, potential students and, you know, people getting out of high school, that somehow, obviously, if you just get like a comm arts, you know, communication arts degree, that's not very focused on anything. Like you can't, it's hard to see what it can do in the specialization context of like, what kind of job, what kind of career, what kind of, you know, trade would you get into? So universities now are like creating more unique like subfields within classically, you know, larger departments for the sake of like trying to make students feel special. And you know, it you can see the kind of practicality, you know, in steelmanning the argument. Like, you know, most people don't, if you get a comm arts degree, you don't get a comm communication arts like job. You get, you know, some, let's say, working in journalism, right? So or you get a fucking bachelor's degree in liberal arts or something. That's not a career that you can like focus it to. So what universities, you know, are saying, like, and we're going to see this list of like super narrow focus to the point where it doesn't make sense to even get a degree in you know, these places. So here, watch.
Studying.
I am studying creative writing.
Going to a private.
Like creative writing, like what's, you know, what are you going to do? Like the actual like getting your foot into the door of creative writing doesn't require a degree. It's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to get this experience and learn how to read and digest and kind of deconstruct, you know, well-known books from the past. But it's then like, if you're going to, let's say, you know, you wrote a book and then you go to a publisher saying, here, can you know, help me publish this? I don't think it's going to matter if you have a degree or not in that very specific field.
An institution for a degree that typically does not have the best return on investment.
But I have a passion for this kind of writing.
But
so
is the degree required?
Yes,
Do you have a degree?
Yeah, I have a degree
In?
liberal math.
Wait. He said liberal math? What's liberal math? Hold up. Liberal math degree. What the fuck is this? A liberal arts mathematics degree? Like liberal, like if you get a bachelor's in science for mathematics, that makes sense. But if you get a bachelor's of arts in mathematics, that makes no sense at all. Like it would, you know, if you get a bachelor's in science and mathematics, that would be a great stepping stone to be like, I'm going to go towards a graduate school program in like statistics or becoming a professor, or, you know, it's conceivable that like, okay, that makes sense to get that undergrad degree. It doesn't make sense. It's like 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4 type liberal math. What's the comment section? Let's see. There's kind of no, there was a joke that liberal math is like you know, girl math. Where 2 + 2 doesn't always have to equal 4.
Hey, what can we get into?
I don't know. What can you get into?
What are you studying?
Graphic communications. It's a super basic art degree.
Okay, so unemployment. Got it.
We built 70.
Graphic communications, like from the student, from getting out of high school, looking at this broad, you know, options of, hey, if I go to this university, go to this specific college and get this very, you know, specific degree, get this idea of like, you're trying to imagine it as a stepping stone towards specialization, not as a gen ed thing. This is not, oh, I mean, I'm just becoming a more enlightened person, but whatever, at least 90% of university like applicants are probably thinking, hey, this is for a degree. It's for a job. And comm arts, that'd be a tough one. So like there is a requirement, a trend in like not just entry level positions, but like getting into managerial and supervisory positions within organizations, businesses, whatnot, where that it's just a requirement to have a bachelor's or a PhD or something like, or master's. So some fields, it does make sense to go that route. And I don't think comm arts would qualify.
$25,000 of student loan debt. Say the degree one more time.
I study Shakespeare.
Okay, Shakespeare, lovely guy. What are you gonna do with that?
Like if you're going into back into the university graduate school programs in historical English studies, that would make sense to I can't believe it's an undergraduate degree in Shakespeare. That's a very, very narrow focus.
Well, that's such a complicated question.
No.
This is where you just have to say, we come from different worlds. You're not going to understand this.
What do you mean?
You won't understand like the precarity and why it's really all right.
What do you mean though?
Like your reaction there was like, oh,
I studied music composition in college. I was in the College of Arts School of Music, but I asked the job and you didn't know what to say.
So I have a lot of experience working at writing centers.
Okay. So we're not even going. We're not even getting into like, I don't know, a PhD program in like historical English studies or something. It's just a hard, it's a pivot. It's not like a sidestep. It's a pivot of like, I've got experience with esoteric English from hundreds of years ago. And it's somehow going to, again, pivot towards helping other people write their own essays.
That, there's availability for those kinds of jobs.
Availability. I mean, that's like anybody who graduated. So like I said before, it's like this, if you're looking at it from like a job perspective, specialization, you think, oh, I'm going to get that edge, right? I'm going to have that slight, elite status by getting this degree. And then, if everybody who graduates from a bachelor's program in the United States has similar skills, it's completely worthless. But if you're extra good at it, then that's like making sense. But this person probably spent, $100,000 at least in getting this degree, where it would have made more sense as like a community college, like side hobby that, hey, I'm really interested in Shakespeare. I'm going to spend more time studying it, and not for the sake of a degree. It's just a hobby.
I also, something I really enjoy is like working with people who are like applying to college.
What do you
So like, they had this confidence initially of like, this is really important to me. This is going, this really developed me as a person. And then they're going to find a job at best that pays, again, these are 2026 numbers, like at best pays, like if they're self-employed, they're probably going to charge like $30, $40 an hour at most. And an entry level, this is like a, $25 an hour. It'd be the equivalent of like a guidance counselor in high school helping students work on their applications and essays. Like that's a tough, they need to pivot towards like social work or something, because that's probably the only thing that, would make sense. So just like I said, getting into this, explaining of like the kind of inter academia business tactics and developments of like previously it might have been just like for that Shakespeare person, the com arts might have been the broader undergraduate degree that they would have gotten, but now the undergraduate degree just says like whatever Shakespearean studies.
Not they go off to linguistics academics or something like that. Not as likely as it used to be. No, then they're going to go off and do things that will make them more money and just put them and I want to make sure. Often it's law school, much more than it used to be. The idea being to go off and find that kind of livelihood. But then it's partly because they're worried that academia is shrinking so much and that there's just no market.
Rightly worried.
Yeah, and that's a real worry.
Are there projects that you can imagine that are not being undertaken in the humanities today because of the problem that you've identified?
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at high schools, there is a classics renaissance going on right now, where at high schools around the country, some of them religious, but some of them also not, there are booming classics programs. There are students who are becoming really interested in classic subjects.
More and more of that. Yeah.
More and more of that, right? And there is just not a place for them. I wrote a couple months before this Mellon piece about the University of Chicago drastically downsizing a number of its doctoral programs, including programs in the classics. And I interviewed a ton of faculty at Chicago for it. And one of them said something that really stuck out to me, which is that, one, this downsizing is really about helping pay off a lot of financial mismanagement at Chicago. Most of these programs, are they money makers? No, but they're in the black. They're not losing money for the university, because in the humanities, you don't really need much. You don't need lab space. So it's not too hard to end up in the black. But what she told me was, I'm in a classics department, and we have all of these students at local high schools and high schools around the country who want to study the classics and want to go to colleges where they can, and we are strip mining classics departments around the country, right? So, there is interest there, and I think there's work that both teaching and research that certainly is going unfunded because of this myopic turn to social justice.
Okay. Well, Tyler, thanks for joining us. It's been fun. If you got any final thing that you want to say, why don't you say it?
No. Look, I think a lot of people see this as a broadside against Mellon, but really, I think Mellon used to do a very good job for most of its history. And I'm just trying to call attention to some changes over the last couple of years that I think have really gotten that organization off track. But no, that's it. If you want to see more of my angry ranting about higher education, I write for The Atlantic, and I co-host the podcast Time to Say Goodbye with Jake Hang from The New Yorker. So, yeah, that's it.
Glad to know about it. We'll be following you going forward. Thanks a lot for your time.
Also on Twitter.
Yes. Yeah. Less and less, but yes. Thank you both.
Take care, Tyler.
All right. So I didn't do that for the previous thing. So for John McWhorter, these guys are experts in the field, just reviewing the guts of the information and, what was talked about. Truth value, I think, is very strong. Were they succinct? As much as, this is a kind of journalistic based interview video. And then typically these two guys, Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter, go back and forth on a particular topic. And, for the most part, like there isn't a lot of fat in the conversation. Like it's staying on topic and, very pointed questions. Chatability, reasonability. It would be a dream of mine to chat with John McWhorter. That would be amazing. I think he's, extremely reasonable. Even if, you're the idiot in the conversation, just spouting, dog shit nonsense, he would have the patience to be like, kind of deconstruct the ideas with you. Even, for some, like if he's the expert in the field and you're just, talking to this grandmaster, that he wouldn't just start yelling at you, for example. Relatable for the general audience. There's some, like I was explaining, there's some context of like the analysis into the history of academia that they didn't like you said, go that far into the past and kind of contextualize everything. I don't think it's meant to, but they still talked in non-esoteric terms in order for the general audience to, be able to follow along. And then, did they address the counter arguments, or what is the strongest counter arguments? Kind of, like what I was mentioning, I think was the strongest counter arguments is the steel manning, the idea that, these are businesses, they have to flow with the economy and, have to listen to and appeal to where the money's coming from. And I think Glenn and John would love it if it's going to be a gen ed thing, it's not for specialization, that it doesn't have this kind of ridiculous funding model that, can lead to obvious corruption. And then if it's going to be a specialization thing, that like, Tyler was mentioning, that, it'd be cranking out profitable, wealth generating graduates, students that graduated, that they could then send money back into the academia system. And that's obviously, successful. It's brought in a ton of money, but that if it's going to be that route, it would make more sense to just have endowments, right? To be able to send money back, and it doesn't necessarily have to be profitable in the kind of short-term sense, but it can be profitable in the long-term sense. And then, obviously the tuition can just be huge to cover the expenses so that it's profitable from the get-go. But it's very difficult to kind of assess the price tag on education when we're talking about an ROI, of return of investment, that's, decades into the future from the individual's perspective. So, yeah. With a concise, yes, I should clean this up a little bit. I don't think we need a grok summary. So I think John the metric that I used for the intellectual channels was 50,000 as the cutoff point. So that if it's less than 50,000 subscribers, it's on one list. And John's doesn't have a YouTube channel, but he's still, like, again, co-host of the Glenn Show. So that's subscribers of 134,000. So I'm going to try to do another lower popular channel before I'm done for today. But John McWhorter, so no channel technically, but I would say strong journalist, conclusion, co-host of Glenn Show. And yeah, he's like John's like a legit intellectual, where he's doing the sociology and linguistic study and trying to stare at, it doesn't necessarily academia dynamics, but, broader society trying to be the most objective lens. So, yeah, let's see, copy this. Save that for that one. Oops. Conclusion. Yeah, great guy. Great guy. All right, let's try another lower population or subscriber count out of 177. All right, 177. Let's see what we get for number 14. Anarch. Anarch? The hell's Anarch? Okay, what do we got? Daniel Berrien, so which aims to explore philosophical foundations of leftist ideas, especially those of anarchists. Oh, cool. All right. So this is probably correct. Sometimes Grok's gonna like hallucinate and like completely come up with YouTube channels that either don't exist or, you know, didn't fit the criteria, and they just, you know, it's a simple mistake. But this guy has 40,000 subscribers. Okay. And revolution, anarchy, constructing revolution. These are 2 hours long. Give me something a little bit shorter. This is going to take me a second. There's anarcho-capitalism, right wing. Okay. Absurdism versus nihilism. Oh my goodness. All right, let's, if you want to take a short break, this might take a second, but right wing hates. I would love to do the 8 values political quiz, but it's 2 hours long. So even if I sped it up, it's going to be like an hour. I can listen to things double time, but I don't want you guys to necessarily have to listen to it double time, because I'm used to doing that, but not necessarily you guys. So, all right. Yeah, we might revisit this guy, but I'm just going to pick the one relatively short, 24 minutes. Absurdism versus nihilism, the rebellion against meaninglessness. All right. 24 minutes.
Everyone, Anarch here. And the world's looking pretty bleak these days.
Oh, Anarch. Okay. Well, that's... I was being stupid. That makes more sense where the name came from and how to pronounce it.
Isn't it? All over our feeds, we see war, genocide, famine, fascism is taking over governments all over the world.
So just so you know, if the speaker has got a lot of like meat to the topic, the conversation, I usually slow it down. And if I have to speed it up, that means there's really isn't much to, you know, per second, like not a lot of information to, you know, digest on. So we'll see how it goes.
And it's understandable if that leads you to feel depressed or hopeless. In these conditions, our systems of meaning start to break down. All of those ways of looking at the world, which are supposed to provide us guidance and reassurance about the future, they start to seem sort of aimless or incapable of describing the circumstances as we're experiencing them. To be depressed by that, to feel hopeless about that, is a natural response. However, that's not where the story ends. Today I want to tell you about the philosophy that saved my life at my lowest point, and that is absurdist existentialism. By the end of the video, I think you'll understand why Albert Camus...
What's the resolution on this? This is 1080? No, that doesn't look right.
...said that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, you should stick around, because that's going to be the topic of our video today. So to understand absurdist existentialism, first you need to understand existentialism.
All right. Before getting into this, anarchism, here, I'm going to have to roll math degree. Okay. So just as a quick historical, you know, history or kind of context. So one of my, you know, favorite website, Etym online. Well, it's etymology is the, you know, the term of like, what's the history of a specific term. So, this website is explaining that anarchy, the term anarchy, the noun, originating from the 1530s, is the absence of government. From French anarchie, or directly from medieval Latin anarchia, from Greek anarchia, lack of a leader, the state of people without a government. In Athens, used the year 30, tyrants 404 BC, when there was no archon, the abstract noun from anarchos, rulerless, from an without, see anarchos, leader, blah, 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 from more getting into more modern use, from 1660s as a confusion or absence of authority in general. By 1849, in reference to social theory advocating order without power, with associations and cooperatives taking the place of direct government as formulated in 1830s by French political philosopher Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. Okay, so that's the etymology side. Here's the Google AI side. Movement that rejects all. So this is the stuff where it's like the deep history side is when there was no government or no ruler, which is not exactly the same thing, but just so you get that context. And then here's the more modern side, and obviously Google AI is deriving from all sorts of Wikipedia, Reddit posts, websites, general discussions, scholarly, books, etc. But so what Google AI is saying, anarchism is a political philosophy and a movement that rejects all involuntary coercive forms of hierarchy, primarily the state and capitalism, in favor of a society based on voluntary association, mutual aid, and self-governance. It advocates for replacing government with decentralized, cooperative, and non-authoritarian structures. So that is not the same as no government, because this is saying there is a government. It's saying how it behaves is unique. Again, technically not, would agree it's not leaderless, because if you had a direct democracy, the people are the leader in that context, and then obviously the people are the recipients of said power. So loosely speaking, it is leaderless in an individualistic sense, but not like there is no government. And then of course the coercion part is very difficult to kind of hash out, because even in the best of like direct democracy, it's going to be coercive. Like we're talking about like, somehow a group of people that is going to come together, loosely speaking, close enough, but then to form a society and an economy and, something. But then somehow it's not going to be coercive. That what if an individual starts deviating from, the cultural norms or whatever it's going to be, and then somehow still call it anarchism when it's going to be some, so this is a lot to kind of deconstruct, but so I've got this spectrum thing that I made up. It's not perfect in any sense. It's just a way to explain ideas. So we got top to bottom, non-oppositional, totalitarian versus adversarial. So there's non-oppositional versus oppositional, which I'm calling adversarial. So you could call, simplify it totalitarian versus adversarial. And then left to right is liberty versus social, or libertarianism versus socialism, where it's how much does an individual, can make decisions about, lifestyle, about, the economy, starting a business, consuming, selling, anything like that. And, just how much liberty an individual has. So like in this spectrum context, that anarchism in the like ancient, what we talked about, like lack of leader, lack of government would be towards, far left towards liberty, right? That's antisocial. If you advocate for anarchism, right? It's a lot of individual has rights versus you got to do what the group says, type rights. So, and then it'd be pretty easy to think that, again, following along with, this visual spectrum thing I have, that anarchism would be towards the left bottom of non-totalitarian. Again, I can change my mind about this, but loosely speaking, like we've got, what is this? Move this around. Hopefully it doesn't. So I'm just doing like MS Paint just to keep this simple, but like pure anarchy in the, ancient context would be this like no government, right? There is no social programs. There is no coercive government because there is no government, or there is lack of leaders, right? So like ancient Greek or Latin, or, that era of like anarchy would be on the far bottom left. That is the most adversarial because people are competing for power and influence in economics as they see fit, and that there isn't this higher, entity, so, like a government to enforce even like an oligarchical, group of aspirations. Oligarchy meaning like a small group of people in charge. So that's, that's the, so here's the really old one. And then here's the newer one where it's anarchy's the involuntary coercive form of hierarchy, blah, blah, blah. So this is getting the kind of gray area where is it still anarchy if you have a non-coercive force or entity, even if it's approved by the public on an egalitarian, so like direct democracy is like the closest example of like, is it anarchy if you have direct democracy? Is it anarchy if the direct democracy creates a police justice judicial system entity that is going to enforce laws, again, all within the umbrella of direct democracy, but they said there's too many goddamn people aren't following the rules. They're, the anarchism, what is it? Voluntary association. So let's say if involuntary behaviors are happening, that you're not going to have an entity like a police or the, judicial system to enforce said rules, then it's like this, like, the snake eating itself type thing of like, you can't make that, you can't keep that as anarchism. It just switches over. Anarchism might have been the thing to start the direct democracy, but it's not going to stay anarchy and non-coercive if, again, still following direct democracy, if everyone voted, okay, this is what we're going to do. This is, how we're going to behave. And then even direct democracy might not be the correct term, because if so typically in direct democracy you have the greatest, the majority wins on votes, but so it's structured as non-coercive, so you would have to have a consensus. Everybody agrees. The entire population of this anarchist society would have to agree, and then if somebody disagrees, they're kicked out. They're, don't get to play with the other kids. Like this, it's. I think this is a pipe dream where, as soon as you try to bring it into reality, it falls apart immediately. If you're going to try to keep the principles, it's one thing to start it and it becomes something else. But if you just say, hey, we're going to, we get to kick people out non-coercively, it immediately stops being non-coercive, so anybody, I just feel bad for anybody who like gets a tattoo of, anarchism on their body, thinking like it's like a very solid system of principles and ideals to like live towards. We'll explore it a lot more into the future, but just to give a context of like, when somebody's talking about anarchism, there is the long history, long time ago anarchism of like, there are no rules, there are no, governments, when some society collapses, that's anarchism, like a Mad Max Fallout, where it's just like tribalism. That is the historical context of anarchy. And then there's the modern anarchy where it's still holds on to a type of government. You could call it self-government, but like, that quickly, like you're trying to like, okay, let's see what it looks like. How would it behave? What are the principles? Are there any conflicts within those principles? And then, it's a shit show real quick. So let's get back to, that was a long tangent, tangent, but at least, you get a whole channel that's calling themselves the Anarch. Hopefully that gives you an idea of like, okay, let's try to make this more digestible.
And to understand existentialism, first you need to understand nihilism. So to begin with, I'll just note that nihilism has a lot of different branches. Nihilism is just the rejection of some meaning or purpose within a field of discussion. So for example, moral nihilism would be the rejection that there is such a thing as moral or immoral statements. However, today I'm not talking about moral.
Wait. Let's listen to that part and then slow it down.
Lot of different branches. Nihilism is just the rejection of some meaning or purpose within a field of discussion.
A rejection of a meaning or purpose within topic, a subject. Oh, crap, this is going to take forever. All right, so just dictionary definition, nihilism, I think is the most. So Google dictionary defining as the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. That's not a great, I mean, it's human nature. Okay, we're going to have to keep on going backwards. All right. So there are two terms to understand. There's sentient and sapient. So sentient is a term that talks about like is able to perceive things. And that's a broad term of like dogs, cats, humans are sentient in that they experience things. Rocks don't, trees, roughly, perceive no, is affected by, the environment, sure. So, we put like trees under like non-sentient, but Venus flytrap, it's like, it's not a like, binary type thing. So that's sentient. And then there's sapient with the P. And then sapient is talking about wisdom or this kind of self-reflection, the ability to think and to like this higher level of intelligence, really roughly speaking. So that, what? Oh, it's unbelievable. That look, what's this? Google saying parrots, crows, dogs, and chimpanzees are sapient. That one's a rough one. So let's see. The animals with potential sapience. So Google AI saying animals with potential sapience are elephants. I don't know how to say that. Cetaceans, dolphins and whales, great apes, corvids. It's a higher level of thinking. It's not so like humans. There are feral children or feral people that lose that kind of sapience. They're sentient in the sense that they experience things, but they might lose the sapient, cognitive, higher level thinking and self-awareness, and kind of not everything is a knee-jerk reaction. So getting back to the nihilism is that moral principles, we can talk about religion for a moment, at a later point, but the moral principles, human sapient nature, the default is that they will always have moral principles. And I'm using moral principles in a very simplistic sense of that they have standards, they have preferences, they have, we could talk about like, okay, beating up a dog or not beating up a dog type of stuff, but like that there might be a disagreement about what should be, moral principles, but that they have their own moral principles, that even if it's like I said, dog fighting or something, that their moral principles is that, I like to be entertained, I like to see violence, I like to see that kind of stuff. And then you got a whole different group of people saying, oh no, you can't do that. That's immoral. So that's a disagreement, but that they don't have it is I think not possible for a sapient human. So nihilism, the Google AI dictionary definition saying the rejection of all religious and moral principles in the belief that life is meaningless. So, from my perspective, this it's kind of a a paradoxical, like it can't actually exist in a person. Obviously, you can like have the kind of linguistic sentiment. It's like, oh, I feel nihilistic. Someone can vocalize that. But if you're observing their behaviors and actions, that they still have moral principles of some type. It's, egocentric to them. It's central to them, but they don't have it is fucking absurd to say. Sorry, absurd is not, I should use a different word. It's fucking ridiculous to say. We're going to talk about absurdism in a second, but so that's the, you know, dictionary definition. Let's see if what the etymology, etymology. Okay. Okay, nihilism from the etymology standpoint, 1817, the doctrine of negation in reference to religion or morals, from German nihilismus, from Latin nihil, nothing at all, coined by German philosopher Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, 1743-1819, in philosophy, an extreme form of skepticism. The political sense, the rejection of fundamental social and political structures, was first used in 1824 by German journalist Joseph von Goris. In form of in fathers of children, blah blah blah, invented it with capital. So-called nothing. Supposedly so called because nothing that then existed found favor in their eyes. You know, trying to like steelman this kind of nihilistic position, that obviously if you come from a very secular, so-called non-religious perspective, higher ethereal principles like what Christianity, you know, supports or posits is you could just be so-called animalistic lizard brain behaviors that is serving itself instead of moral principles. Like that would be a way to steelman the argument, is that everyone is myopically behaving, or has behaved in a myopic sense, only seeing short distances, not this kind of long-term, you know, like I said, ethereal principles about, you know, moral authorities and whatnot. But that they don't have it. That's rough. So, all right, that was a long kind of trying to contextualize this. Let's get back into the video.
So, for example, moral nihilism would be the rejection that there is such a thing as moral or immoral statements. However,
statements? I don't know if that's the right word. Like behaviors and perspective or mental perspective, it might have been a more accurate term, but let's see what he says.
Today, I'm not talking about moral nihilism. What I'm talking about today is existential nihilism. Existential nihilism is the claim that there is no inherent meaning or purpose to life. We can see this being addressed most significantly by Friedrich Nietzsche in his oft-repeated statement that God is dead, God remains dead, and we have killed him. But a lot of people don't really understand what Nietzsche meant by this statement.
So there is within the study of like sociology or anthropology where a false dichotomy, or you could say binary, is conceptualized, where if you don't have the Abrahamic Christian version of religion, if you don't have the Abrahamic Christian version of God, religion, whatnot, then you become atheistic or secular, which is obviously not correct. You could just have a completely different religion. But there should be understanding, contextualizing this, that God, obviously, God in the English American context and European context, obviously references the Christian God, and so there wasn't, within certain people, within certain like anthropology lineages, that there is no then third alternative from that binary of have God, not have God. There can't be anything else. So
Nietzsche didn't literally mean that God is dead, nor did he actually think that we killed God. Nietzsche didn't even believe God existed to begin with. Nietzsche is making a statement about modernity. In particular, Nietzsche is noting that when we had large-scale, society-wide understandings of a divine being, this gave us a sort of common direction and a shared meaning at the social level. Entire nations believed in the same ideas, and that gave them a unified narrative to understand the world. However, as the Enlightenment progressed, it produced a worldview that didn't really have any need of a god or the supernatural. In fact, it showed us that there was really no good reason to believe in God, spirituality, or the supernatural to begin with. The universe actually made a lot more sense when it was understood.
Okay, so another hopefully short tangent. There is the group of people that argue so this guy, Daniel Marion, the Anarch, is talking about how less and less religion is needed to explain things from like a technological view, as understanding of sciences and whatnot, where in the past everything was explained with the context of a godly, miraculous intervention or, some divine hand, and how obviously over centuries we're becoming, we understand where diseases and bacteria, sickness comes from, the discovery of the concept of bacteria, and how it's not just purely the kind of like intentional punishment from a god. It might just mean that you didn't wash your hands or, didn't wipe your ass or something like that. So there's this macro societal change in people's at least behaviors that, rather than like, if you're sick, rather than showing up at the church, if you're sick, you're probably trying to get to the hospital. So that's what he's talking about. There is the other side where, the religious and the behaviors of secular, principles or secular behaviors are trying to, kind of coexist at the same time. We're saying science and God or, religions can still exist because the explanation being that God created, perpetuates, and influences science. So it's like still holding on to religion, even as, like I said, macro society is getting less explicitly religious, and more people are just, like I said, showing up at hospitals instead of going to church in order to get over a sickness. So
understood as a physical construct, not a spiritual one. And ethics made more sense when they were grounded in universal human needs, not the dictums of a holy being.
Right. So a monoculture can be formed when there's this kind of monolithic religious entity and government and systems. Obviously you go back in history long enough that there was no separation of church and state. The church and state were one within, various societies from the past, that they were one and the same, that the churches were running things. And then obviously going into modern society, that's less and less of a thing. Obviously, separation of church and state, not just America, but multiple nations are going that route.
However, without that all-present divine rulership, what this did was produce a society where meaning was socially fractured and individual purpose was ungrounded and aimless, at least in a metaphysical sense. Beforehand, each being was crafted carefully by an all-knowing deity. Afterwards, we had to accept that there was no driving purpose in our creation.
So this is like the kind of change of like rule of God versus rule of law and nationalism, where I think he's, kind of denoting this idea of like liberalism or libertarian kind of principles of like, if we don't have ethereal religious, moral principles, handed down from a deity, a god, that we could just do whatever we want. But in reality, it's, we still have laws. Like obviously America has a lot of laws, and many other nations have laws that one could say nationalism has or continues to replace the kind of monotheistic, or non-secular kind of perspective on life. Like nihilism, and we'll see in this in a second, is saying like that you could just do whatever you want because you don't have this father figure God to listen to. And well, let's see how this goes.
We're just the result of a physical process elaborated ad infinitum. The modern human, therefore, has no metaphysical driving purpose and no shared meaning with fellow humans. However, Nietzsche was not himself a nihilist, even considering this fact. In fact, he warned of the dangers of nihilism. Nietzsche thought that nihilism would only lead to fear and aimlessness, and he called this possibility passive nihilism. By contrast, he advocated what he called active nihilism, which is the active affirmation of new values, recognizing the death of the old world of meaning. So now let's return to the fuller quote about God being dead, which comes from his book.
Just as a side note, like, as much as one could argue that there was a very strong religious force that ran governments, or was the government, or ran, operated, managed nations, there was still a human aspect to all this. So that if you were, a ruler from 1,000 something years ago for, a nation, like rarely, I would only say even only in the modern context are people like strict. I think Quran in the Middle East would be the best example of trying to follow the book. But if you were talking like 1,000 years ago, that religion was more of a facade. It was a theatrical performance, that the rules and principles would change as needed by whoever was ruling the nation. So in that context, it's secular and religion as a tool. Yeah.
Thus spoke Zarathustra. In the book, a madman is wandering the streets and shouting at the townspeople, and he says, "God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How can we console ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? The holiest and the mightiest thing the world has ever possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood from us? With what water could we clean ourselves? Do we not ourselves have to become gods merely than all history up to now?" So if Nietzsche was critical of the concept of nihilism and he was afraid of its possible outcomes, then why did I start with Nietzsche? Well, the simple answer is because Nietzsche is usually considered to be one of the earliest existentialist thinkers. He rejected nihilism and he tried to find a path through the apparent meaninglessness of the universe, which is, as we will see, one of the key features of existentialism.
Wait, this is a video about absurdism versus nihilism? Okay.
Existentialism claims that while the universe has no inherent meaning, human beings are the creators of meaning. Meaning isn't an objective phenomena, it's a subjective phenomena. I've explained this before to people by telling them that humans are meaning manufacturing machines. That is to say that we, by our very nature and by the very mechanisms by which we move forward in the world, produce meaning, whether that meaning exists objectively or not. So this is one of the key features of existentialism. Existentialists don't despair in the recognition that the universe comes along.
All right, let's take a little, I don't know, I gotta do another side quest. Existentialism. All right, existentialism from Google AI is saying existentialism is a 20th century philosophical movement emphasizing that existence precedes essence, meaning individuals are not born with predefined purpose, but create their own meaning, identity, and values through free will, action, and personal responsibility. God, that is brutal. That's, I mean, it's sounding like a very, I think it's cohesive with libertarianism that, you know, make their own meaning, their own identity and values, make their own values through free will, action, and personal responsibility. Not entirely true, but you know, you can have the kind of mental bumper sticker kind of perspective on it. Like the unfortunate part about like trying to get into any type of historical discussion is that these terms are contrasting whatever, you know, popular concept was at the time. So existentialism, the term, like the word, you know, existentialism actually doesn't do a great job like kind of putting together the definition of itself. Like, so the postfix ism is the advocacy or in the belief of. So if you just said existential by itself just means relating to the topic of existence. So supporting or the advocacy of the topic of existence obviously is not the same thing as what it's talking about of, you know, existentialism, of that it needs to be the precedes the essence of existence precedes essence, meaning that individuals are not born with predefined purpose but create their own meaning. Like, that's not a great term to encompass that idea, but you know, that's the fucked up baggage of history that, you know, at the time that was the term that was coined, and then now you have to do all this background research for a word that doesn't fucking make sense in the contemporary, you know, perspective, but it would make sense back then. So in the contextualized, you know, this whole like, I don't know, predefined purpose, but create their own meaning type thing, I would call more libertarian, or, you know, liberty in the sense of people making their own, you know, manifest destiny, you know, creating their own destiny type thing, instead of calling it existentialism. So that's the context of that. So we'll get back into the YouTube video.
With no inherent meaning. Instead, they advocate that we proceed forward in creating our own meaning that is.
So creating their own meaning, like, there are default aspirations for humans, animals, like, you know, food, sex, pleasures, you know, competition, etc., where I don't think existentialists would agree that they're changing the default human nature aspects, but that in the context of, and this is, it's like, we didn't understand history. It's like, okay, in the context of not living under a religious government, it feels like you should do, what you want. Yeah.
Situated in our own subjective experience. And to be fair, this will require a new kind of individual from the one that came before. Nietzsche called this individual the Übermensch. Kierkegaard called them the Knight of Faith. These brave people don't despair when met with this new paradigm. They embrace their position. If meaning is manufactured by humans, then our job is to reject the existential crisis and create our own meaning. We're not put into this world with some overarching, life-defining purpose. We find that purpose in our actions. If the narrative of the old world was based in some transcendent essence, this new world is determined by the facts of existence. For this reason, how we are situated in the world determines what sort of meaning we will conclude and how we must live. This is why existentialists say that existence precedes essence. Your existence, your situation in life is what determines your meaning. Your work isn't to accept a meaning given to you by others, but to find a meaning that arises out of your own life and to live by that meaning with utmost sincerity and conviction. When I came across existentialism, it was actually really reassuring, to be honest. It was actually helpful that it started with the statement that life is inherently meaningless. And I'm sure that probably sounds depressing to some of you, but to me it was not depressing at all. In fact, it was deeply refreshing to just kind of be told that directly. It set my expectations in a way which was much more reasonable, and therefore I felt a lot less confused. The universe just wasn't made with us in mind.
So this existentialist perspective, like I said, in this context of like libertarianism, essentially, if you really boil it down, manifest your own goddamn destiny, right? Is like kind of the thesis statement. It's empowering in that aspect that if you take a libertarian perspective, that the idea of you're responsible, you got to do your own thing, you can make things happen, and you should make things happen, perspective versus this like your destiny's already set in stone, can't do anything about it, just go with the flow. If you get fucked over, that's just the cards that you were dealt with, so deal with it type of thing. So in that perspective, in that narrow focus of like the idea of, what is it? Not authority. It's not sovereignty. There's a term, autonomy. In the sense of autonomy, it's like, oh my goodness, I can feel like I'm in control of my life now. In this chaotic world, I can manifest my own destiny. Yeah.
The world isn't some kind of twisted experiment of an illogical, ineffable God. We're thrust into the world without answers, and it's our work to find them. In this, existentialism gave me a guiding understanding of the world. However, I couldn't help but feel as if there was still something missing. Just to know that we make meaning in the world doesn't really dismiss the feelings of the darkness of the world, or why it still feels so challenging to embrace that fact after we have accepted that there isn't that inherent guiding meaning that is available to take us in the right direction. But it wasn't long before I stumbled across somebody who was wrestling with this exact issue, and that was Albert Camus. Albert Camus created a philosophy called absurdist existentialism. So what is absurdism? Well, absurdism looks at the two factors that are at the center of existentialism. Number one, that there is no inherent meaning in the universe. And number two, that we are bid to create our own meaning. And it notes that there's still a tension in this process.
Wait. So, okay, there's too many tabs going. All right. Existentialism versus absurdism. I didn't even spell it right. All right. What does Google AI say? Existentialism versus absurdism. Both terms agree that life has no inherent preordained meaning. Existentialism argues that individuals must create their own subjective meaning through free will and responsibility. And absurdism argues that searching for meaning is futile and one should instead embrace the absurdity of life by living defiantly. It's just say, fuck it. Don't try to bring any moral principles. It's like the counterculture, like what is it? Nonconformist that becomes conformist problem of by trying to reject for meaning creates his own meaning. Okay, all right, let's get back to.
And that tension is that the universe has its own direction, its own laws, its own imperatives. Things proceed forth whether we want them to or not, and whether they fit our meaning or not. So what Camus is pointing out is that this always produces a feeling of existential ennui, a feeling of internal crisis. And he has created absurdism as a way to address that crisis that is at the center of existentialism. While the universe has its own function, we are telling all kinds of stories which may or may not match up with the universe, and ultimately they cannot completely match up with the universe. The universe is too impossibly complex for any narrative we are to develop to completely envelop the functions of the real world. As Camus...
I don't know if this is going to be addressed, but like, you know, it's sounding like Camus or the absurdist is like creating a false binary of like, is it worth trying to grasp society and the universe and how it operates? And that Camus absurdism is saying, don't even try.
Camus says, toward the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, the mind's deepest desire, even in its most elaborate operations, parallels man's unconscious feeling in the face of his universe. It is an insistence upon familiarity, an appetite for clarity. The mind that aims to understand reality can consider itself satisfied only by reducing it to terms of thought. This confrontation between our own self-given structures of meaning and the meaninglessness of the universe, Camus calls the absurd. The absurd, Camus says, is, quote, born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. Camus says that this tension is part of existence and that it naturally leads to despair. In fact, he opens the myth of Sisyphus by saying, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. These are games. One must first answer. So what is Camus' answer? Like Nietzsche spoke about the Übermensch and Kierkegaard created the Knight of Faith, Camus posited that we must become the absurd hero. Camus tells us that, yes, there is this eternal tension, and yes, it does bring about despair, but it's in our ability to embrace this tension and to move forward in recognition of that fact that we become great. There's been this flowchart going around for years, which sort of summarizes Camus'...
Whoa, that was a lot. What is going on? That's a big diagram.
That we become great. There's been this flow...
Why do anything in the... What is it saying?
Fact that we become
okay,
great.
Just trying to catch. Why do anything in life? Okay, so some diagram we're just going to gloss over. Starts with because there is an existential void and emptiness. It's not a great start. Is that even a question? Usually a flowchart has like a binary yes or no options, and you're just starting with because there's existential void and emptiness. Oh, that's fucking okay. This is too much to try to deconstruct.
There's been this flowchart going around for years, which sort of summarizes Camus' arguments.
Oh, this is a lot. If life is meaningless and emptiness, just do nothing about it. Okay, so like poetically, it feels like you can say, you know, like I said, figuratively saying that do nothing about it. But if you're alive, again, a sapient human that is self-reflective, makes at least the, you know, perception of decision making in a so-called chaotic world, it's not possible to do nothing about it, to not take, you know, trying to find, you know, even the pursuit of, you know, like desires and aspirations, like that's still doing something. So it's not possible to do nothing, which apparently is nihilism. But all right, this is gonna make my head explode. Yeah, so well, this is interesting. Like, if anyone's studied like Buddhism, like not contemporary Buddhism, but like, kind of the core principles, is that there is an emphasis about the separation, like trying to detach oneself from aspirations, which, if possible, right? If possible, the big if, that if you can separate yourself from aspirations, you can no longer feel, sad. If you don't have standards, there's no, you don't have to suffer. And Buddhism makes this the main thesis, the main point, the main goal is to no longer suffer, right? So that the, was it enlightened individuals, the bodhisattva, can choose to reincarnate for the sake of pulling people, the job of, getting more people to moksha, to leave the cycle of suffering by getting people enlightened, which, obviously it's got its own set of problems to figure out. But that this topic that we're talking about, absurdism versus nihilism, is talking about very similar things, is, how to address this kind of perception of suffering. Yeah, this is, I need to gloss over this because there's no way we're going to get through these boxes. Like, I'm literally going like every 5-10 seconds, stopping and taking these tangents, but all right, we gotta keep going.
And the myth of Sisyphus. And even though I think that I have a few disagreements with what's in the chart, I think it's a really good guide for people to get a feel for what Camus meant in the myth of Sisyphus. So I'm going to use it as a guide in this following section of the video.
Don't get stuck. Do not get stuck in historical perspectives. If you get nothing from this entire discussion, work on the present tense, your goddamn problems, your views, and then trying to make sense out of your reality instead of going down these rabbit hole, like side paths of what did somebody from, the past thought about the topic, and then how I should then change my views of my current self. Do not get stuck in the past. The language stuff is ridiculous that we've already, we've already talked about, like the term existentialism is not the best coined term for those, the definitions of like, so-called meaninglessness or making decisions or whatnot. So, if you wanted to be a historian of, like, I don't know, psychology or sociology, then it would kind of make sense to go down these rabbit holes. But if this is the stuff you're struggling with, do not fucking start with this kind of crap.
And hopefully will help you understand some of the arguments of the book as well. So we've already talked about the feeling of existential emptiness. God is dead and we have killed him. You know the story. Camus says we have two possible responses to this: to do nothing or to fill the void.
Oh, fuck. Now we're going to have to go through these boxes. God damn it. Okay. If the question starts with why do anything in life, there can't just be one option. Like, to be fair, you got to start with more than one box. But okay. Going over this godforsaken, crappy mind map diagram. Because there's an existential void and emptiness. Okay, that's not entirely true. Again, this is in the context of, if God's, not around, what do we do with ourselves? And apparently you just get stuck with nothing. There's not, nothing, no human desires, no aspirations that, you've already have and just need to realize it's just apparently nothing. There is no goal, aspiration, standards to like work off of. It's just an so-called existential void. All right.
If one chooses to do nothing about these feelings, they'll naturally just move toward nihilism, or passive nihilism, as Nietzsche would call it. This is the paralysis seen in modern life. People stuck doom scrolling rather than acting, wallowing in depression instead of being part of the world. However, it's difficult to stay in this mental space for very long. This paralyzed existence naturally leads to meaninglessness, which leads to sorrow and despair. This represents an unwillingness to confront the absurd contradiction directly. Camus says that there are two ways to cope with that unwillingness to confront the absurd. Said simply, people turn to either religion or suicide. Indeed, that's where I found myself when I originally came across absurdism. I was, as Camus would expect, stuck between suicide and religion. I'd chosen against religion.
Why? Why is it a dichotomy? Why is it only two goddamn choices? Like, okay, I
was feeling like I wanted to stop living. So here's what I mean when I say that Camus may have saved my life. To escape from the despair of non-action, which drives us to religion or suicide, Camus says that we must make a solemn vow. This vow is to ourselves, not to be defeated, to endeavor forward, even recognizing the absurdity of existence. Camus tells us that we must rebel against the existential crisis, that we must assume the burden of rebellion. So what about the other option? He said we can either do nothing, which is where I was at 15, or we can fill the void. Choosing to fill the void is not necessarily bad. In fact, as you'll see, both options to the crisis of meaninglessness lead to the same conclusion.
Here, so when I was talking about like Buddhism, there's, one of the core like ideas is that meditation is the act of detaching yourself from standards, morals, aspirations. And then what you realize is that's not fucking possible. It's, you cannot separate from aspirations. Like, what was there was a stupid game as a child in school. It was like called The Game or something. And then like the goal was to not think about the context of the game while you say a certain word. It was something really dumb where it was just a paradoxical impossibility of like saying some whatever word that wasn't in the context of being aware of so-called the game. I think, I'm not even going to look that up. It was such a stupid thing, but it's like kind of mesmerizing for like a 12-year-old to do. But there, as soon as you try, like there's an aspiration, even if you're meditating, you're aspiring to be silent, to be conscious of your breath, to aspire to, detach yourself from consumerism, or, something like that. Like you're still aware of it. And the only thing that would actually separate yourself from like aspirations would be a lobotomy, like just a clean, like ice pick to the, to the brain of like, that's the detachment from, of unfulfilled, aspirations that cause us suffering. So this idea that it's filling in the void is fucking ridiculous. That's not the default for, let's say a person, separates from the church or whatever. And then they walk out the doors and be like, what am I going to do with my life? Like you already have desires, whether or not, it's like higher order, kind of like high moral thinking is a whole different, topic in of itself, but it's as though it's not like you don't have anything. So I'm just getting upset at this for no obvious reasons.
If one accepts the burden of rebellion. However, there are some very negative ways to fill the void. One of the most negative ways that someone can try to fill the void is to seek power over others, to become a dominator. The empty individual eschews religion, rejects morality, bypasses meaning completely, and instead chooses the path of the dominator. However, this never eliminates the emptiness they feel inside. Indeed, that emptiness, armed with power, becomes a prolific force of
Trump. Trump bites. It's like, oh no. I want power.
Destruction, both for the
I have the best power.
outside world and for the dominator themselves. The person who seeks power over others, having spent their entire life for its achievement, but having never filled the void inside them, lives within a perpetual existential crisis, which they never resolve. No matter how much power they have, it's never enough. They always need more. That's because they're running away from the absurd, and having done nothing to resolve it, they're stuck in a death spiral. When this quest inevitably fails to give them a sense of fulfillment, look at how our rulers become obsessed with hidden lives of debauchery. It's no coincidence that rulers have lived these hidden lives in every era where their power has become absolute. In fact, Camus says that one of the other negative ways that people try to fill the void is with fleeting pleasure, comfort, and distraction. This is probably why...
All right, so there's a point of like, and it's an interesting discussion about sapient human nature of whether or not that's a default setting, this kind of, inclination towards amassing, collecting more and more influence or power, which, you could say like a movie star likes the idea of being more influential. The president likes the idea of being more influential, and that, it is, pretty obviously most people, whether it actually happens is a different discussion, but that they have that inclination of people like the feeling of being influential, and that, they put a Facebook post and, they get a bunch of likes, like, ooh, I feel good because I'm getting that attention. Obviously the reality is like, if you become, the most influential, you become a target. That if you got, a billion YouTube, subscribers, there's going to be entire like organizations coming after you, trying to knock you down, and that it comes at a cost. You can't just get pure power and no, kind of like consequences, so to say. So, it seems odd that at least that part's not being like brought up in this, it really should be talked about of what is, list of human natures in this context of trying to find so-called meaning in life.
The rulers so often form these hidden hedonistic lives. They have the power to dominate, and yet the void of meaninglessness is still eating them alive. But this isn't something that only powerful people have to deal with. We all know poor and powerless people who numb the pain of existential crisis with drugs, food, sex, and other forms of fleeting pleasure as well. In fact, I've been here numerous times in my life. I always felt like I was doing something good for myself when I did, and I think it was okay as a distraction when I needed time to heal or just relax. However, once it becomes your entire life, it just becomes destructive. Every act of pleasure seeking becomes a reminder of the emptiness you're running away from. Paradoxically, you're seeking pleasure in everything you do, but the emptiness becomes even more of a feature of your life because everything you're doing becomes about running from it. So then, whether we choose to do nothing and fall into nihilism, which we seek to numb with religion or escape, or whether we choose to fill the void with domination of others or pure pleasure seeking, we find ourselves at the same impasse. This existential crisis is the all-consuming trouble of human existence, and Camus tells us that the only escape from this crisis is not retreat, but confrontation. This confrontation with existential crisis is to engage in meaningful action, even knowing that the universe has not prepared us with a meaning to follow. Confrontation with the absurd requires us to take responsibility for ourselves and responsibility to shape our own futures, even knowing that we'll be faced with the absurd time and time again. To endeavor forth in the creation of meaning is to accept that we will struggle, that we will never perfectly square our visions of meaning with the incomprehensibility of the universe. Once we accept this burden, once we accept that a meaningful life is a challenge, we must then commit ourselves to the fight. Camus' solution is meaningful.
It sounds like it's this great thesis is being made, but if the context is a secular, non-religious, no deity existence, and then you're making decisions supposedly to find fulfillment, like it's like telling somebody manifest destiny. It's like, it's not terrible advice. It's just not that great, because it's like and we might, get clarification in a second, but it's like a libertarian perspective of like, well, that's what people have been doing, is that they have been trying to find meaning through various actions. And then some people are getting into, like I said, drugs or alcohol, and then they find meaning through that. And then who's to say if it doesn't have meaning? Because we no longer have this, kind of godly figure to, make those types of decisions. So you're still stuck in this kind of lack of direction, so to say.
Activity, not passive ideology. You will never be made whole just by thinking the right thing. You'll only ever escape the despair of the existential crisis by direct confrontation with the crisis, by choosing meaningful action even though you know that one day you'll be met with difficulty because of it. When you return to despair, remember the promise you made to yourself. Remember that you share this struggle with all of humanity. What you choose reflects your vision of humanity and its future. Within you, human action is cultivated and made real. Remind yourself that there's no alternative that will...
I love this zooming in, this very slow zooming in, like it's like a super motivational speech. It's like, look in my eyes. It's like, you haven't said anything. Say, manifest destiny, make good decisions. Oh, geez, I really needed that advice. Make good decisions. Oh, man. I just needed to be told. Thank you so much.
Not make you miserable, that joy and fulfillment will only be found in this rebellion. If you can do this, you will be what Camus calls the absurd hero. The perfect symbol of the absurd hero in Camus' eyes is the Greek mythological figure Sisyphus. Sisyphus was cursed by Zeus to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity. Every time he reaches the top of the hill, the boulder falls back down into the valley. Our attempt to make meaning, to act within our circumstances with purpose and commitment, is to push the boulder up the hill. And to be met with the challenges of the universe, to have our purpose undermined by existence, is to have the boulder roll back down the hill. So maybe now you understand what Camus means in the myth of Sisyphus when he says, I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burden again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe, henceforth without a master, seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. So, as promised, now you understand what Camus means when he says, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Our role in this existential drama that has been laid out in existentialism and in absurdism is to become the absurd hero, the knight of faith, the Übermensch, as Nietzsche would call it. In this, we have to accept that there will be struggle, that there will be a challenge, that will be met with feelings of hopelessness and despair and feelings of meaninglessness as our models of the world are forced to confront the real world. If we can do that, if we can proceed forward with bravery and commit ourselves to such a task, we will fulfill the role of the absurd hero. And I think that that's exactly what we have to do if we're going to live through the world that we're currently met with. Anyway, here's to hoping the video doesn't get demonetized given the topics that we are discussing, but if it does, just recall that you can support the channel by becoming a patron over my Patreon, which is patreon.com/anarch. On the screen, you can click through on the little link that's up there, or you can go down in the description, click there, or you can become a member through the YouTube channel. Down there, if you're already subscribed, I believe that then you just click like join or something like that, and it will essentially take you to the integrated Patreon for YouTube. You can also just tip me directly through the Cash App link that is in the description. Also, if you want to support a Netflix that is formed as a workers cooperative, you should...
All right, we gotta keep going. All right. 24-minute thing that probably took us more than a half hour. All right. So that was a delayed thesis. I'm saying, between absurdism and nihilism, here's what you should be doing. I'm fucking exhausted already. So, getting back to this. All right. Capital T truth value of this video. I'm glad I didn't do the 2-hour version. That would have taken like 4 hours. So we've got, there's a lot of contextualization that was missed, and the kind of practicality of whether or not going back into history to, read a book and then hopefully derive something that you could use in the present tense. It's missing some of the, the basic like dictionary stuff that I would say, better contextualized the, even from the, whatever, the author, the historical perspective, like, okay, from that point, what's the context? And then, the thesis so, the truth value of the thesis is leaning towards, I guess, absurdism, but that's the equivalent to saying, hey, you should, you're telling somebody, hey, you should do stuff that's more meaningful to your life. Which is like, from like idiot's perspective might seem deep, but it's not when you get into the reality of what does that entail? What does that get to? What are you talking about? Because if you left religion and then you're, in this position, I'm assuming the idea is that you're not going to go back into religion, that you would find, some sort of like libertarian self-fulfillment aspiration. So I love the zoom in, be like, this is really meaningful stuff, All right. Was it succinct? Yeah, pretty much. I mean, again, I think it was missing a bunch of meat to the discussion, but 24 minutes with this little quotes and all that kind of stuff was as succinct as can be, real boiled down. Chatability, reasonability, kind of, sort of, like, we got Daniel Berrien that it's, so when you get into discussions with these type of people, if they do the thing where it's like, hey, you gotta, understand the historical perspective. You don't get it, man. This is what existentialism means. Where like the words in the contemporary sense, like existential, existence, and then adding an ism, obviously means completely different thing than how they're using it. Then that kind of reasonability is more difficult, right? That, the speaker would have to be going back and forth like I was doing, of like, here's the historical use, here's how they're using it. And then here's like, the modern person trying to get into it. Like there's a hill, so to say. So like, oh, you gotta read Camus before, all this stuff. And just briefly going through the, list of videos, this is more of like a historian's kind of journalistic deconstruction. And it's one thing to just keep it in that of like, here's what, some Camus said, but then they start to get personal. It's like, here's how I'm, involved with it, or, to engage with it. It's like, that's less about journalism at that point. Now it's like, trying to give life advice. So it's not, I don't think it's a complete like hard wall, can't talk to them type thing, but it sounds like you already need to have, I don't know, a few hundred hours of historical knowledge to like keep up with him. Relatable for the general audience, that's difficult. Like, like I said, the historical stuff is going to make it extra difficult. Argumentative, what is their thesis? So they were leaning towards absurdism in the way that it got defined, and how somehow you're going to find some deeper meaning just by saying that you should go for a deeper meaning. Do they address the counter arguments? Not really, just cherry picked, because it's not cherry picked. They were following what Camus already said, or somebody else already said, and how the historical person was addressing some, perspective at the time, such as, views on religion. So yeah, I'm not going to do a grok summary of this. I'm already exhausted, making my brain explode from as soon as the mind map diagram, I was like, no, we gotta go slower. The first box was not even You know, it's too many steps skipped. All right, so that's the wrap up. Oh, let me quickly do the Anarch. Okay, so taking it off this list, deleting from that one. Okay, Anarch. How would is it a fair assessment of? Okay, what would he be categorized as? He's not. He did journalistic work, a deconstruction of past events. An armchair spectator. I think it's an armchair spectator. I think he's. I might change my mind about that in the future, but for now, that's how it's going to go in. And the point is that he's talking about his perspective into those topics and did as much research as he wanted to do. And it's not his intention to talk about every perspective of that topic about the meaning of life or, something like that. So I wouldn't call him a journalist. That's a higher standard. That's a different thing to talk about. Obviously, if you don't like it, just comment and, we could duke it out in the comment section, but, I think that seems fair. So, I'm going to switch over to my stuff. So, last time we were talking about the kind of introduction of what Dear Sue. Okay. So, we were talking about, this kind of political spectrum stuff and how, to me, and we could argue about this, but to me, this is a much fairer understanding about how societies and nations can be kind of structured, that the pushes and the tug of war that happens within politics, we can go further and closer towards libertarian values or socialism values or totalitarian values. We can, that it can kind of navigate that way. So what I wanted to expand on is I had a list of, so we see this is a visual thing. So the arrows are talking about these forces, and I wanted to start filling out what like specific things could push, or what's the result of pushing towards one direction or the other. So the point of the kind of up-down totalitarian versus adversarial is this spectrum of like how much competition and how much like meritocracy kind of happens, where when you have a totalitarian system, it's, stereotypically nepotistic, that it's, hey, you're, my brother's friend, you're in, oh, you're a stranger, you're out, right? Is that they're just trying to find people that align with their values. And if you don't align with those values, you're out, right? But in adversarial thinking, that the competition is, an aspect, a goal that makes society function, in a way that is more meritocratic. So, when you have a upward force, again, we're just using this left, right, up, down, within my spectrum, that the upward force is atrophy, that, the lack of competition creates weaker people, that for example, North Korean Kim Jong-un doesn't have to be the toughest guy. You know, he's, like I said, this is the example of the complete totalitarian that, you know, Kim Jong-un is fat as fuck. That, you know, he wasn't picked out of the line of, you know, of applicants, and, you know, he was the most intelligent, the strongest guy around. He's, you know, the son of a monarchy of the Kim, you know, lineage. So, you know, this in direct contrast with, at least even in, you know, democracy in the American context, at least there's like a semblance of like, oh, you know, there was a competition, the general election, and that, you know, so-called, you know, people liked the better person from their perspective. But so again, this upward force is atrophy, and then the downward force is, you know, competition, and more, you get into more democracies, one way or another, that the peoples are voting either in the purely political sense of like an election, or voting with their dollars of like, now you have competition between businesses, and that you're trying to win, you know, quote, quote, votes, so to say, through the, you know, people's spending habits. So, you know, we get into that, and then these left to right of the liberty versus social, or libertarianism versus socialism. The rightward force, like socialism, is that you have a higher trust of the general population. Is that obviously if everyone's doing whatever they want, like a libertarian society would advocate for, then by definition, they're not a monoculture that everyone agrees on the same thing, but it's, you know, multicultural. And that even basic stuff of like how to talk to people, how to solve problems, how to, you know, buy and sell, you know, goods and services, anything at all. In a more socialist economy, you can trust that you share the same values. In a more libertarian one, it's less likely. So that's the rightward force. The other one was, let's see, higher trust, adversarial and competitive. No, wait, that's so with rightward force, you would have more welfare. Obviously, if you're talking about socialism, more likely to have welfare programs. Not a guarantee. Obviously, North Korea is not a great example of a welfare program, but compared to a libertarian society, that's, you know, very unlikely to have a welfare program. So, for example, welfare is defined as like a safety net, that kind of a, you know, equalizing force. That obviously in a more libertarian society, it's like pull yourself up by the bootstraps, by your own bootstraps, and that you're responsible for your actions, even if that, you know, not everybody gets the same opportunities, finances, you know, resources from birth. That's just, you know, the rules of the game. So the leftward force is that everyone is more individualistic, and we'll get over the kind of, we'll try to define like a purely libertarian society at some point. But so that, you know, the leftward force is that individuals making their own decisions when it regards to economics or politics, and that, you know, if you like multiculturalism, that a libertarian society would be where to be at. Multiculturalism. So less trust and, you know, no safety net. Again, just following like pure principles. Obviously, there's the historical stuff, like, you know, there's a kind of paradoxical, like calling yourself like a liberal socialist or something like that, which, you know, if you completely detach away from the actual like pure definitions of the words and you just make up your own thing, it's whatever. But if you're just sticking with the words and just saying, okay, we got to follow some linguistic consistency. We can't just make up our own shit every time we don't like a term. You know, this is trying to bring some like fairness and consistency in that regard. So let's see, equality, the concept of equality. It's unfortunately, it's both, like the concept of equality. So it gets muddied up because of equity and equitable and all that kind of stuff. So like libertarian liberty in that sense is equal, that if everyone's given the chance to manifest their own destinies, that's liberty. But then in the social sense, if everyone's together collectively operating, it's equal in that regard. So I'm just not even going to include it as like a left, right, up, down force. But it's still an important topic at some point. So that's it for today. I'm tired. You have any questions, just, you know, comment below. I'm going to try to do these once or twice every weekend, nothing on the weekdays. And then, you know, just start, you know, chipping away at this. The future, obviously we're going to cover more YouTube channels. But the near future of this kind of spectrum stuff is talking about, like, I think next week is going to be the various examples of 2D spectrums where it's got like 50 examples in the spectrum. You can find those online of like, oh, this is, you know, anarcho communism. This is, you know, social Darwinism, or, you know, some other stuff like that. I wish I had time to do it today, but yeah, that took too much time. So see you guys next week. Bye.